Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto has Meliodas' power harem. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by TACHYON99, link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1. The legend begins. 15 years have passed since the Kyuubi attacked Konoha in the Uzumaki training grounds. A 13-year-old girl with long blood-red hair that reaches her lower back and deep purple eyes is currently trying to use what look like 4 purplish chains with kunai-like endings that are coming out of her back. Watching the little girl were 2 women, one looked like an older version of the little girl with blood-red hair that went down to her mid-back, deep violet eyes, and a happy smile. The other woman, however, looked slightly strange. She also had blood-red hair that went down to her upper rear, red slitted eyes, and whisker marks on her cheeks, while also having a happy smile. However, what made her look strange were the fox ears on top of her head and the 9 swishing tails behind her that all were covered in orange-red fur with black tips. "Mom. Kurami. Look, I almost got it." The girl squealed while jumping up and down in excitement, which caused her to lose focus, making the chains dissipate back into chakra, causing the girl to pout and the 2 women to laugh at her antics. "That was very good, Naruto," Kushina told the now named Naruto, "but next time, keep your focus and keep practicing so that you can eventually summon and use them like it's second nature," she said while summoning her own chains, which mostly waved lazily swayed behind her, except for one that went and picked up her daughter, bringing her closer to her before giving her daughter a hug after dissipating the chains. "It also helps make them easier to control so that you don't accidentally hurt someone," Kushina said, letting go of her daughter and seeing her nod her head up and down. "I will, I'm just excited about almost having them down so that I can be stronger as a kunoichi," Naruto said with a big bright smile on her face before it turned into a sad frown. "I also miss Naruto Nai," muttered Naruto sadly, getting Kushina and Kurami to also frown sadly. Kushina and Kurami knew who she was talking about and they missed him too. Kurami moved towards Naruto and got on one knee so that she became level with Naruto's height and said, "Don't worry about your brother. He's still doing fine and I know this because I can still feel my chakra inside of him, meaning he is still alive," Kurami said with a smile, getting Kushina to smile at her friend for cheering up her daughter. "Besides, we all know it wasn't his choice to leave the village," Kurami growled, getting angry looks from Kushina and Naruto as well, both knowing whose fault it was that Naruto wasn't there with them. Flashback, 1 year ago, midnight. "What do you mean I'm being banished?" shouted a slightly deep rough voice that indicated it belonged to a teenage boy. Said boy was a 14-year-old boy that untamed, spiky, silverish blue hair and red eyes that had a touch of violet to them. He was wearing a closed black vest that had trimmings the same color as his eyes with white fastenings, black shinobi pants with lines going down the sides of his pants and the same color as his eyes as well, bandages wrapped around his right thigh that held a ninja pouch in place, with another on his right hip behind him. Finishing off his look were a pair of black shinobi sandals, fingerless, black, leather gloves with metal plating on the back of the hand, and a headband with a strange leaf design wrapped around his right arm. However, currently, he was face down on the floor, with his hands being restrained behind his back by an Anbu with grey, gravity-defying hair, with a mask of dog. This was Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze. And he was currently being banished by none other than his father, Minato Namikaze, who looked at him with a cold look in his eyes. Minato Namikaze, the Yondaime Hokage, looked at his son before replying, "You are being banished because you were found guilty for the death of your teammates and Jounin Sensei on your last mission and for stealing money from the Konoha reserves," Minato said without an ounce of remorse. Naruto grew furious at these accusations. "That's bullshit. They attacked me because they wanted to rape some of the women we rescued on the mission and I refused and threatened to report them, and I have never stolen anything from the reserves. I don't even have the clearance to get to the vault or know anyone who does," Naruto shouted, enraged at such ridiculous claims. "You will watch your tone when speaking to your Hokage and father," Minato roared, furious at how this demon was speaking to him. "You're not my father," Naruto shouted back, "you've never treated me like a son, and clearly you must be getting old if you can't remember that. Since I'm being banished, that means you're no longer my Hokage, which means I don't have to listen you anymore." Minato sneered at Naruto before schooling his expression but keeping his cold eyes trained on Naruto. "It matters not. You have 1 hour to gather your things and leave the village." Naruto glared at Minato before Inu let him go, which let Naruto get up, rubbing his wrist from being held for so long, and took off his headband, but instead of handing it over to the Hokage, he crushed it in his hand, showing his physical strength, and dropped it on the ground, which made Minato angry, as that was basically a way to say, "Fuck you," to the village. But that Naruto left, not seeing the looks of sadness that appeared on the faces of 7 women, 3 of which could not be seen due to the masks they wore, and 1 of which belonged to his mother. Naruto had his stuff all packed in scrolls with a backpack and was jogging towards the main gate to leave when he saw 3 of his best friends waiting for him by the gate. Naruto slowed down and looked at the 3 girls before him. One had black hair that they kept in 2 buns, making them look like panda ears, and gray eyes. She was wearing a pink long-sleeved pajama blouse with red trimmings and yellow buttons, pink pajama pants and blue shinobi sandals. The other had long brown hair that was kept in a ponytail with 2 strands of hair framing her face, large black eyes, and a set of fang tattoos on her cheeks, signifying that she comes from the Inuzuka clan. She was wearing form-fitting gray short that ended her mid-thighs, black shinobi sandals, and short-sleeved jacket that she has partially unzipped, showing that she was wearing a white t-shirt underneath. And at her feet were 3 gray furred dogs with white furred bellies that reached to her knees. The third had short dark blue hair that was cut in a harem style with 2 strands framing her face and a pair of pale, pupil-less eyes that have tinges of lavender in them, signifying that she comes from the Haikta. She is currently wearing lavender-colored pajama pants, blue shinobi sandals, and a cream-colored jacket that has fur lining the cuffs and bottom of the jacket. These 3 were Tenten Higurashi, Hana Inuzuka and Hinata Haikta, 3 of Naruto's best friends. 2 things that all 3 had in common were that they had tears in their eyes and they all had matching necklaces that were pieces of aquamarine carved into the shape of a fox that matched up with many other women's and girls' necklaces in the village. An ban sin tattoo. Naruto looked at them with sad eyes before saying, "Hey you 3, started Naruto, what are you guys doing here?" The 3 started crying before they launched themselves at him, hugging him while crying and saying, "We don't want you to go," over and over. Naruto sighed knowing what they wanted, but he knew that he couldn't stay much longer or else the Anbu will execute him on the spot. "I'm sorry you 3 but I can't stay or else I'll be executed by the Anbu," Naruto said, getting the 3 to let go and look at him. "Then we'll go with you," shouted Hana, not wanting to be separated from Naruto, along with the other 2, who were nodding their heads looking at him with hope in their eyes. But that hope disappeared when he shook his head, denying their request. "You can't do that, you guys have family, friends, and responsibilities who love you and need you here," Naruto said with a small, soft smile before looking over at Hana, "Who's going to help the animals and take care of your mom, Hana?" Naruto asked, making Hana look down with a sad look. "Or what about your dad and his shop, Tenten? Who's going to help him with all of that?" Naruto asked Tenten, making her also look down with shut eyes. "And what about your mom and sister, Hinata? Who's going to help Hitomi or your sister?" Naruto asked, causing Hinata to let her tears flow again. "I know you guys want to come with me, but you have to stay here and help your families," Naruto explained, "and besides, I'm banished and only the Hokage can change that, and I highly doubt he will," Naruto said, angry at Minato for being such a rotten bastard of a father and even worse Hokage. His words though made them realize, what if there was a different Hokage? They could call him back. "We'll find someone to become Hokage and if not then one of us will in order to bring you back," the 3 of them shouted, surprising Naruto with their conviction before he smiled a real and true smile that made them all blush. "In that case," Naruto began with shadowed eyes, making the 3 wonder what he was going to do. Before he surprised them by kissing each of them deeply on the lips with such passion, it made their knees weak. Afterwards, he smiled at each of them and said, "Let that show that we will always be together, no matter where I am, and as a promise for the 4 of us to meet again, someday." They all smiled before he turned around and began jogging towards the gate before running out into the world. The 4 never saw Kushina and Naruto standing on a building, watching the 4 while gripping their own necklaces. Flashback end. As the 3 remembered what happened last year, they grew even more determined to find out where he is because a lot had changed over the past year. Before they could continue down this train of thought, they heard 2 people walking over to the group and they turned to see 2 women standing before them. One was a tall, blonde woman with beautiful brown eyes. She was wearing a gray, sleeveless kimono-style blouse held closed by a broad dark bluish-gray obi that matches her pants, black-heeled shoes, with a green haori over that with kanji for gamble on the back. Her blouse may be closed, but it still shows a considerable amount of her J-cup bust. The other woman is of average height, with shoulder-length black hair and onyx-colored eyes. She was wearing a bluish-black kimono with white trimmings held closed by a light purple obi that still shows she is wearing a mesh armor shirt underneath with black open-toed sandals with low heels. These 2 were Tsunade Senju, the god Aim Hokage, and Shizune Kato, her apprentice and personal aide. One thing that can be easily noticed are a pair of necklaces that they were wearing around their necks, however they couldn't see the charm. 2 months after Naruto's banishment, Kushina tracked down her old sensei, Tsunade Senju, and requested for her to come back and become the Hokage. At first, Tsunade refused, saying it was a fool's job, until she heard Kushina begin to beg for her to come back and help her get her son back. This stunned Tsunade because in all of the time that she had known and taught Kushina, Tsunade had never seen her former student beg. Tsunade, after getting Kushina to calm down, found out the reason why Kushina was asking for help to get her son back was her ex-husband, the current Hokage, had banished him for false charges and was one of those bigoted people who didn't see Naruto for himself. After that, Tsunade agreed to come back but explained that unless Minato was forced to step down or chose to, she wouldn't be able to help. Kushina told Tsunade that she had that part handled. Eventually, Minato was arrested by Anbu and publicly executed along with the old advisors after it was discovered that Minato had banished his son on false charges without evidence, knew about Danzo's stealing of children from clans for his root and for allowing the civilian council to commit crimes and then get away scot-free by paying him some money. Once that was done, Tsunade was inaugurated as the Goddamn Hokage and she set about all kinds of changes. Like the execution of the corrupt members of the civilian council and the hiring of the new civilian council. She also took back all of the money that was stolen from the Konoha reserves, which turned out to be the amount that Naruto was charged for, and put it back in the Konoha reserves, and the rest of the assets were given as payment to all of the necessary sections in Konoha. This was 3 months after Naruto was banished. "What are you three doing?" asked Tsunade, with Shizune sharing a curious look. "We were training and then talking about Naruto and how much we miss him." Kushina replied, getting sad looks from both Tsunade and Shizune. Tsunade because she wasn't around to meet or try and help her godson, and Shizune because she would have very much liked to meet Naruto. "Don't worry, I still have the scroll with a recall message ready for when you find him. Just keep looking and I know he'll turn up eventually." Encouraged Tsunade, getting huge smiles from all of them. Kurami then realized something. "Hey, what charms do you have on those necklaces of yourses?" This brought the attention of Kushina and Naruto onto Tsunade and Shizune, who both looked surprised by the sudden question, but they pulled them out and showed the charm. When they saw the charm, the Kushina, Naruto, and Kurami were all shocked to see 2 aquamarine fox charms. This shocked the three because they knew that only Naruto makes those charms and he hadn't been seen in over a year. And they remembered Tsunade and Shizune wearing those necklaces when they came back to the village. Kushina shakily asked, "Where did why you get those?" Naruto and Kurami were looking at Tsunade and Shizune intensely, awaiting their answer. Tsunade and Shizune were confused by these reactions, but Tsunade decided to answer, "We got them a year ago from a 14-year-old boy." Tsunade answered, then asked curiously, "What did he look like?" Naruto asked. "He was 5'7" with wild silverish blue hair that extended past his shoulders with bangs beginning to grow over his face, crimson eyes with a tinge of violet, wearing a grey muscle shirt and black pants with black combat boots." "Why do you ask?" Tsunade asked after describing what the boy looked like. It was then Tsunade and Shizune's turns to be shocked when they saw Naruto and Kushina pull out their necklaces that were exact replicas to their own. "We're asking because you just described Naruto," Kushina replied, and also because only he knew how to make those necklaces, anyone who tried to make them failed and the necklace was either broken or misshapen. "How long ago was this?" Naruto asked, hoping for a trail on her brother. "It was about 2 weeks before you came to me, Kushina. He had met us and we all started talking when my debt collectors found us and tried to get me to pay. He then asked if they play a game where if he won, they would forget the debts and if they won, he would take the debts on himself. He won and then actually made a bet for my family necklace, and when he heard me say it was cursed, he simply laughed and said his luck would be stronger than some stupid curse. He saw how much it meant to me and he then gave us both these necklaces." Tsunade replied, feeling shocked at unknowingly meeting her godson who helped her with her debts. Kushina, Naruto and Kurami all had smiles knowing that he was okay, however before they could celebrate his safety, Anbu Nico appeared with a stack of papers and a small black book. "Okage-sama, I have brought the latest edition of the bingo book, as well as some wanted posters," informed Nico, revealing that this was a woman. "Thank you for the bingo book, but why the wanted posters?" asked Tsunade politely, after taking the bingo book and posters, curious about why they are there. "The wanted posters come from the continent of Britannia and are the members of the group known as the 7 Deadly Sins," replied Nico, earning intrigued looks at the name of the group and shocked that they received wanted posters from Britannia. "You see, it was over the past year that Britannia was discovered by the elemental nations far across the ocean. Travel took a week to get to Britannia, but they made it and established trade routes through Nami no Kuni in order to get items such as cloth, food, and sometimes bounties in return for copies of the bingo books." "Thank you for this information, Nico," thanked Tsunade to Nico, who nodded her head and was preparing to return to her post when, "Before you leave, can you tell me why this group is called the 7 Deadly Sins?" Tsunade asked, curious about the group's name as well as the other 4 present. Nico nodded and said, "Of course, Hokage-sama. Apparently, the reason they are called the 7 Deadly Sins is because they are 7 of the most brutal criminals in Britannia who carved symbols of 7 beasts onto their bodies. They are, the dragon sin of wrath, Meliodas, the serpent sin of envy, Diane, the grizzly sin of sloth, King, the goat sin of lust, Gother, the lion sin of pride, Escanor, the boar's sin of gluttony, Merlin, and the fox's sin of greed, Ban. These 7 were the most brutal of criminals who were eventually brought on as the strongest and cruelest chivalric order of knights in the kingdom. However, apparently they betrayed the kingdom by murdering the great holy knight, Zarathustra. Sunaid heard the wording of the final sentence describing their crime, apparently. Asked Sunaid with a raised eyebrow. Nico nodded, yes, apparently because it has been discovered by some spies that we have in the kingdom that the holy knights are not as holy as they appear. They have a secret history of performing crimes, such as raiding, pillaging, and rape, all while stating that they have the power to do so, simply because they are holy knights with only a select few being honorable. Nico informed, well sounded venomous at the end when talking about the holy knights. The others were no better as they too were furious at how these so-called knights acted simply because they had power. Sunaid calmed down and asked, thank you, when was it that the sins apparently betrayed their kingdom? It was about 7 years ago when the death of the great holy knight and the framing of the 7 deadly sins took place. After the event, they scattered all over Britannia, and they have not been heard from except for Ban, who is being held in a prison that is the same as the lowest level of a blood prison, Nico informed, which received looks of surprise, shock and horror, but Nico continued. However, he wasn't arrested, he simply walked in and turned himself over while saying, it might be fun to experience prison here, before they locked him up in a room, while pinning him to the wall, with steel spikes piercing through his limbs, holding him with a curved double-ended spike, holding his mouth shut. Nico informed, causing the looks of horror to increase in severity at the cruel punishment. How can they do something like that? And why would he say it would be fun? Asked a shaking Naruto with Tsunaid, Shizune, Kushina and Karami, looking to be thinking the same questions. Nico understood their reactions for she had reacted much the same when she heard this information. Nico then decided to inform them of some information that had also surprised her when she heard it, do not be alarmed just yet. Another epithet Ban goes by is Undead Ban because he has proven to take any punishment, no matter how severe and fatal the wound, he always comes back looking just as fine as before he received the injury. He never dies and when he does, he comes back looking just as alive as before. Nico informed, which instantly changed all of their looks from horror to surprise, amazement and intrigue at how such a feat was possible. Nico then said something that surprised them all. It has also been said that the 7 deadly sins Ban knows the location of a certain someone that I am sure will shock all of you. Nico said cryptically, getting the group to focus on her again. Who? Asked Karami, curious about who Nico could be talking about along with the others. Nico looked at Kushina and Naruto and said, apparently, he knows the last location of your son and brother, Naruto. Naruto and Kushina went wide-eyed at that along with the others and shouted, he knows where Naruto was last. I have no guarantee, said Nico while shaking her head, but it could be possible to ask and see if it's true, because apparently, he based his looks off of Naruto. Tsunaid nodded her head at the idea before, that is an excellent idea. Tsunaid exclaimed, before turning to Kushina, we will send a group to Britannia in search of Ban, and should they meet one of the other sins, they will ask if they can assist in searching for Ban. The group nodded in excitement before Tsunaid said, but not right now. Why not? Asked Naruto and Kushina, showing that even though one is a full-grown woman in Jounin, they can still be childish. Tsunaid shook her head at their antics, because right now you aren't strong enough Naruto. I know you want to go and see Britannia and find your brother, but right now you need to keep training to get stronger, so how about this, Tsunaid explained, if you can get stronger and keep training, I'll let you go with the group in 3 years, because that is when I will send them in search of this Ban. Naruto thought about the deal, it had always been a dream to see Britannia when she heard about a continent far across the ocean. She thought about it and realized that it was the best she would get, if she got stronger, she could better protect herself, and when she finds her brother, she could show that she can stand by his side as an equal. She looked at Tsunaid with a fierce look of determination in her eyes and nodded her before she looked at Kushina and said, Ka-san, let's get back to training. Tsunaid and Kushina both looked on in pride at her sudden attitude, and both knew that no matter what came she would go far in the future. Naruto looked at her necklace one more time before she closed her eyes and thought, I will see you again someday, Naruto Nai. The next day, the entire village was gathered in front of the Hokage Tower waiting because they had received a message saying an announcement would be taking place. The whole village waited, wondering and chatting amongst themselves about what the announcement could be. They didn't have to wait much longer as soon they all saw Tsunaid and quieted down when she raised her asking for silence to speak. I know all of you are wondering what this announcement is going to be about and I will tell you. I have decided that in 3 years' time, we will send a group of ninja to the continent of Britannia. Tsunaid announced, which shocked everyone and caused them to start talking amongst themselves about why she would do such a thing. Tsunade let them talk for a minute before raising her hand again, getting everyone's attention and quieting them down. I know that this seems strange and sudden, but there is a reason for this. We have recently obtained information about the last known location of clan heir, Naruto Uzumaki. Announced Tsunade, who was met with stunned silence from the village at the possible location of one of their heroes. You see, when Minato was arrested and executed along with the corrupt council, Tsunade set the record straight about how Naruto was just like Naruto and was a Jinchuriki that helped keep the village safe by holding half of the Kyuubi, and that should he have died all those years ago due to the village's abuse, then they would have unleashed the Kyuubi onto themselves. This information shocked the entire village that they had been mistreating one of their heroes. Once this was known, all of the villagers who took part in Naruto's abuse growing up paid repercussions to Kushina and returned all of the extra money they took from him. The shinobi who took part were given the choice to be executed and have all of their assets seized and given to Kushina and the Uzumaki clan, or be placed on 1-year probation of no work and no paid leave. Public apologies to Kushina for the mistreatment to her clansmen and son, go to Inoichi for therapy and to see if they are fit to continue as shinobi for Konoha, and finally, they had to undergo any punishment assigned by Kushina. Kushina knew it wasn't their fault that they were misled and decided that when Naruto returns, they will serve Naruto however he wishes and will not complain. The shinobi agreed wholeheartedly, knowing that whatever gave them the second chance, they would not waste it. Tsunade then decided to continue. You see, early yesterday, I had received my new copy of the bingo book, along with 7 wanted posters from Britannia of 7 people who altogether make up the group known as the 7 Deadly Sins. This received reactions of curiosity on why this would be important. Tsunade then explained, this is significant because the sin known as Ban was the last person to ever see Naruto, and so the group will go to Britannia in order to seek him out and ask about Naruto's location. Tsunade finished, which got everyone to understand now why she mentioned the group known as the 7 Deadly Sins. Tsunade then added, I will be deciding the group a month before the designated day that the group will leave in search of Ban. This got many of the shinobi excited at possibly getting a chance to find Naruto and see Britannia, but then Tsunade said, however, only a group of 6 to 8 shinobi will leave to Britannia in search of Ban. Therefore, if you wish to join the group, you must have a valid reason for wanting to join, otherwise, your request will be denied. This got many of the shinobi to drop their heads, knowing that they didn't know Naruto well enough to give a good reason. However, among the shinobi present, a group of women and girls knew exactly why they wanted to be the ones that go to Britannia. These women all looked different and all had different jobs, however something that they, along with many others, had in common are the necklaces that all share the same charm. The hand-carved aquamarine stone in the shape of a fox. Meanwhile at Britannia, in Britannia, near a town called Dalmary Town, there is a prison called Base Dungeon. Inside the dungeon is a cell that is guarded by 2 guards who were talking about what food to eat later. Inside the cell, however, is a prisoner who is being held by 11 steel spikes that were pierced through his limbs, with another curved double-ended spike being held where his mouth is in order to prevent him from talking. He was 6'11" and was currently shirtless with only unbuttoned purple pants with metal studs covering his lower half. He had long silverish blue hair and matching facial hair that had started growing out. He had spikes in his shoulders, his forearms, and an extra spike in his right bicep, spikes in his thighs, shins and feet. All of these spikes pierced all the way through his limbs into the wall behind him and ended with big loops in order to prevent him from sliding forward to escape, with some of the spikes having bits of chains connected to the hoops. On the left side of his abdominals, his has the tattoo of a red fox looking over its shoulder with a mark that looks like a circle with 8 lines of different lengths extending from it. An regular fox sin of greed symbol. This was Ban Fox, the 7 deadly sins, Fox's sin of greed, and he was currently sleeping. Now normally, one would be in immense pain from this form of imprisonment, but Ban didn't care and just continued to sleep through this. Suddenly, he began to stir and opened his eyes, revealing crimson-red eyes that had a tinge of violet to them that looked around in curiosity before he began humming a random tune while thinking, I wonder what the others are up to and how everyone is back home. They probably forgot all about me these past several years. Time skipped 3 years. It has been 3 years since Konoha found out on a possible lead to Naruto's location. Over the last 3 years, Naruto trained with all her might in order to become stronger so that she would be able to leave with the group to Britannia. Going along with Naruto were her mother Kushina, her teachers Anko Mitarashi, Kuranaiki, and Hana Inyazuka, her best friends Hinata Hikita, Tenten Higurashi and Satsuki Uchiha, with the latter of those 3 being her rival. They had left the elemental nations over a week ago and had already arrived in Britannia. They are all wearing their Shippuden outfits, and I will describe Kushina, Naruto, and Satsuki. Once they arrived, they began asking people on if they knew where the 7 deadly sins were. However, instead of being told, they were chased out of the port they had arrived in and were now currently traveling across the lands, asking towns and villages they pass if they had any information on any of the sins. This received results when they were told rumors of a wandering Rust Knight that was supposedly one of the 7 deadly sins. With this new information, they began searching for the knight but came up empty. Currently, the group was resting in a tavern called the Boar Hat that was filled with drunk men. So, any news? This was asked by Hinata Haika and she came along to find her shared boyfriend Naruto. Nothing, we couldn't find out anything new other than what we know. Hinata's teacher, Kurenayaki answered and she came along to help find Ban and provide support by using Jinjutsu to allow easier escapes and retrieve information easier. Damn it. Why can't we find anything? This was exclaimed by Naruto, who had definitely grown up over the years. Naruto wore a red kimono-style blouse with black trimmings over a mesh armor shirt, black bicycle shorts, and a red apron skirt with black low-heeled sandals. Strapped to her hip was a katana with a white wrapped handle and a black sheath that had a red fox design. Calm down, Naruto. Remember, it takes time and patience to get information. Yeah. You can't expect information to just come to you and go, hey, here I am. Without you having to lift a finger. These two were Anko Mitarashi and Hana Inuzuka. Anko came in order to retrieve information from any enemies they encounter and capture. Hana came for the same reason as Hinata, to find her shared boyfriend. They're right, you know. The best things always come to those who wait. This was said by Naruto's mother, Kushina Uzumaki. Kushina now wore a black short-sleeved shirt with a red hooded jacket vest that had white fur lining the hood and black form-fitting pants with black shinobi sandals with her signature katana, the Red Queen, strapped to her back. She came along because she wants to find and reconnect with her lost son. So relax a little. Yeah, can't have my rival getting weak and tired because she was stressed and didn't relax. Tided the voices of the 2 final members of the group. One was Tenten Higurashi and the other was Satsuki Uchiha, twin sister of Sasuke Uchiha, king of all emos. She had onyx black hair that reached to her up back with shoulder-length strands framing her face and matching eyes. She was wearing a black kimono-style blouse with white trimmings, while underneath she was wearing a mesh armor shirt and had bandages wrapped around her chest. She also had a black apron skirt and short shorts with black low-heeled sandals. She was also carrying a katana that had a white wrapped handle and a black sheath with her clan symbol of a red and white fan designed into it. Tenten came along because she wanted to find her shared boyfriend, and Satsuki came along so that she could also train and memorize training techniques used in Britannia for the elemental nations. I know, it's just that it's been almost a month since we've been here and the only lead we have so far is the so-called Wandering Rust Knight. Naruto replied, and the group understood how she was feeling when they were suddenly brought drinks. They turned to the person to see a small kid with messy blonde hair and green eyes. He was wearing the bar uniform that consisted of an ordinary clean white button front shirt and a black sleeveless vest on top with a loosely worn tie. While wearing white pants that ended his knees and a pair of black boots but doesn't wear socks. On his back is a little green bag with a purple zipper, along with a sword scabbard with a sword handle appearing over his left shoulder that takes the shape of a green dragon. Here go. You girls look kind of stressed about something, so I figured some drinks would help. The boy said. Thank you, but aren't you a little young to be working as a waiter? Asked Kushina, feeling her motherly instincts kick in over the young boy. I'm not a waiter. My name's Meliodas and I'm the owner. Replied the boy with a smile. This got confused looks from everyone on how a little kid could be the owner and where they heard his name. Hey sonny, what's that there sword you got? Asked another drunk man. Before the boy could answer, however, some bandits with swords came in and began shouting, alright. Hand okay, vary your money, you old folks. Then they spotted the group of women and looked at them with lust, and you women are coming with us as well. One of the bandits said, before he kicked lips which got the women to cringe in disgust. Before they could defend themselves, however, the boy from before appeared in front of the bandits with a plate of food and said, hey, do you want some food first? The bandits and women looked at him like he had grown a second head, while all the men shuddered in fear for a second. The bandits looked at the food and saw that it looked delicious and decided to eat the food and then continue with their rubbing of the people in the tavern. However, the instant they all took a bite, the bandits began spitting out the food with cries of disgust. He shook his head and shrugged his shoulders while calmly saying, oh well, still gross. If you knew it was horrible then why did you feed it to us? Shouted the bandits. So you can tell me if it's still bad. The boy replied calmly. We'll kill you. The bandits shouted. Clean it up. The boy said with a serious face before snapping his fingers. Geez, what a pain. What do you want from me? Oink, said a talking pig that was walking over and was pink with a clover-shaped mark on its rump. Hawk, clean the floor. The boy said. How about feeding me some better scraps? Hawk said. The boy must have taken offense to that because he then turned around and said with a serious face, "If it's a whole pig roast, I'm confident I could do it." Hawk then began exclaiming how the scraps were absolutely delicious and the best in the world. This got the reaction of making everyone laugh at the duo's antics. The bandits were starting to get annoyed and were about to begin shouting again when Meliodas appeared in front of them and said, "I suggest you fellows leave before I get upset." The bandits grew fearful and ran away. "Hey boy, can you really fight with that sword?" asked one of the men, which gained the attention of everyone onto the boy. The boy just smiled and shook his head while pulling out the sword and putting it straight into the air to show that it was a broken sword with only 3/4 of an inch being the actual blade. Nah. This received even more laughter from the people, including the women, who despite being shocked at the display, couldn't help but find the situation funny. Before anybody could say anything else, however, a man burst in, panting with a scared look on his face. The man then looked at everyone and said, "I saw it." This got everyone to quiet down and listen as the man sat down and began to tell everyone about the night. This got reactions of people saying that they were just stories that parents used to tell their children to behave, or else the 7 deadly sins would come and get you in blood-rusted armor. And basically the part in the anime when they are all talking. Suddenly, everyone began to hear a loud, metallic thumping sound coming from outside the door to the tavern. Everyone began watching as suddenly the door opened up to reveal a large figure wearing rusted armor walking in, before saying, "The 7. This got all of the men to run out of the bar, leaving only the curious young bar owner and a group of women who all looked surprised to find the person they were searching for suddenly do the exact opposite of what Anko had said earlier. "Hello, would you like something to drink?" asked the young bar owner, getting looks from the women like he had grown a second head. "The 7 deadly sins," the knight muttered one more time before falling backwards to the floor, where the helmet fell off, revealing the face of a girl with silver hair covering her right eye and an earring hanging from her left ear that had a blue gem with the designs of a sun and moon with stars in it. Later on, we find the group in a room with a young girl laying on a bed and the rusted armor lying in a corner. The young girl was wearing a black skin-tight jumpsuit with black leggings that extend from her mid-thighs to just before her toes, with matching black wraps on her arms covering from her wrists to just before her shoulders. The group, young bar owner and Hawk, had all been surprised, except the bar owner, at seeing such a young girl wearing all of that armor. While they were initially surprised, the group then became protective when they saw the young bar owner try to grope her chest with the excuse of making sure she was okay and alive. This got him thrown out of the room by the group of women before they asked Hawk to get a basin of cold water and a towel. Currently, the girl was resting on the bed with a towel that was soaked in cold water on her forehead, sleeping peacefully while the women were talking about the girl. "So, any ideas on why she would be walking around in such a big suit of armor in this heat, clearly for a long time, if the heat stroke she is suffering from says anything?" asked Tenten, knowing from her background as a co-owner of a weapons shop that metal armor will build up heat from being in the sun and when it's hot. "No idea, but we could ask her when she wakes up," offered Naruto, which got the group nodding in agreement, and maybe she knows something about the 7 deadly sins from what she was saying. Naruto mentally added, figuring that the girl must know something. "That is very true, and she also seems to have some strange energy coming from her, but I cannot tell what it is." Naruto didn't react to the voice in her head because she knew that it was Kurami talking to her from inside the seal, for you see, when Naruto was training when she was younger, she used too much chakra at one point and knocked herself out, where she eventually found herself coming face to face with Kurami, who explained that she didn't want to attack Konoha because she actually liked Konoha, if only because it was Mito's and Kushina's home, and that she had been forced by an Uchiha who called himself Madara. This had shocked Naruto, but she decided to trust Kurami and told her mom when she woke up, where they decided to look at the seal and rewrite it so that Kurami could have a body outside, but her power would stay inside the seal and be regulated by Naruto so that she wouldn't die because she was not strong enough to survive having a Biju removed from her seal like her mother was. "Okay, I'll keep an eye on her just in case she turns out to be dangerous," replied Naruto. "Okay Kit, and I'll let you know when we start getting closer to Naruto, because currently, it feels like he is stationary and has been for a few years now," informed Kurami. "Got it," Naruto answered before snapping out of it when she and the rest heard the girl begin to stir. They opened her eye to show a dazzling blue eye before she looked around curious about her surroundings and was surprised to see the group all either standing or sitting around her. The girl gained a slight flustered look and stuttered, "Hello, there," while waving her hand. "Hello, it's good to see that you're up and feeling better. You gave us quite a scare there when we saw you passed out from heat stroke," informed Hana, having some medical experience even though it was mostly towards animals. The girl looked even more flustered at that, "Sorry about that," she apologized while bowing her head. The group just giggled at her antics and told her it was fine and that she didn't have to bow. They soon found out her name is Elizabeth. They then began to talk about what she was doing, wandering around in such big armor in this heat, and she informed them that she was looking for the 7 deadly sins. The group and Hawk were all surprised at hearing that answer. Before they could continue however, there was a loud noise from outside in the main part of the tavern, where they heard a bunch of knights saying they serve under some Lord Twygo, in search of the Rust Knight who had been spotted in the area. The group came out of the room after telling Elizabeth to stay put and were prepared to defend the girl when they heard the bar owner say that he knew where the Rust Knight was, and then Hawk exclaimed he was the Rust Knight when he came out with random pieces of the rusted armor that Elizabeth had been wearing strapped to his body. Before anyone could do anything, a knight outside began shouting about a woman running into the forest. The knights gave chase to Elizabeth, saying they just had to tire her out before Lord Twygo arrived. As the knights were chasing Elizabeth, they were being attacked by the group and Hawk. This caused the knights to focus on the group and not notice Elizabeth being picked up by 2 people into a tree before the last knight ran off the cliff. In the tree were Elizabeth, Meliodas, and Naruto looking down as the knights fell. "So, how does the rest of that story go? Why are you looking for the sins?" asked Meliodas and Naruto at the same time, just as the rest of the group began appearing. Elizabeth began explaining that she was looking for the 7 deadly sins in order to stop the Holy Knights. As she was explaining all of the horrible things that the knights did, they were unaware of another presence approaching them. Meliodas began saying how it might not be possible to find the sins because of some rumors that they all died, when Elizabeth exclaimed that they were too amazing in order to die so easily. The group looked at her in surprise when suddenly the ground began shaking. It turned out that the cliff had been sliced clean through and was falling to the ground. Standing on the area where the cliff was sliced stood a knight with a thick mustache and dark red armor. The knight looked down and said, "Confirmed. 10 unknown people, dead." He then looked behind himself, "Is that alright?" He was asking the 4 knights that were standing behind him. "But Mr. Leone was beneath the cliff," said one of the knights. "Then we can say 11 dead." The knights were shocked at how calmly this knight said that and said, "But Lord Twygo, that's horrible." The now named Twygo turned them and asked, "Then, 15 dead? Anything but that?" The knights shouted in fear. The 5 knights then heard several sighs of relief and turned to see the group of women with a red-headed teenage girl carrying Elizabeth and Meliodas carrying Hawk and Mr. Leone. The 4 knights shouted in surprise and relief, "Mr. Leone. Twygo, however, what are you all doing alive? Don't change my confirmed death toll." The entire group minus Elizabeth and Mr. Leone all shouted or calmly said, "Don't confirm it on your own." As the group was checking on each other, Twygo saw Elizabeth searing. "Well, it seems I'm in luck. That symbol is of the royal family. Which means you are, confirmed, Princess Elizabeth," he exclaimed, getting shocked looks from the group except for Meliodas. "Princess Elizabeth? As in the princess of the kingdom?" The group and Hawk shouted in surprise, while Meliodas just looked curious. Twygo then said, "There is a search order for you throughout the kingdom. You won't run, will you? The order is for your capture, but nothing can be done if you were killed in an accident." The group began running into the forest, with Elizabeth shouting how she can't be captured and that she won't give up. Twygo then swung his sword in their direction while shouting, "Confirmed. Accidental death." Once he swung, he caused the entire forest to be cut down, but everyone was okay, except for some scratches and dust, with Hawk being the worst with a stick being stabbed into his rump and Meliodas having his left sleeve blown off. Elizabeth was lying on the ground crying about how she was being saved by a group she didn't know and a man whose name she didn't know. Meliodas then smiled and told Elizabeth that his name was Meliodas, causing her to be surprised, and she along with the rest of the group all finally noticed the symbol on his arm. A dragon. Elizabeth stuttered in shock, with the others being surprised as well. As she was saying this, Twygo came up to them and swung his sword down on them, causing a huge cloud of dust to appear. Twygo stood there thinking this time he got the group of people, when suddenly he was hit with a blow of strength, blowing him back. He looked up and everyone was surprised to see Meliodas wielding his broken sword in his left hand. Twygo grew angry at this and began shouting, You plan on fighting me with that trash." "Trash is just fine," answered Meliodas. Elizabeth then began asking, "Are you really that Meliodas?" Twygo was shocked hearing this. "Meliodas, wait, I remember seeing your face before." "No, if that's the case, then why do you not look any different from before?" Meliodas then stood with his sword ready, as if to swing from the right to the left with his knees bent. "Have you figured out who I am?" Twygo got a look of fear and began shouting, It can't be. Truly, you are Twygo," then swung with all his strength shouting, "Uaire." Meliodas then swung his sword out and introduced himself, 7 deadly sins, the dragon sin. Meliodas. Twygo was then hit with all of the power that he used when he swung, sending him flying. The group and Elizabeth all looked at Meliodas in shock as Meliodas just calmly watched Twygo go flying as he said, "Oh. He sure went up high." He then resheathed the broken sword, turned to Elizabeth and said, "Well, looks like you found the first one, Elizabeth. About the remaining 6, I've actually got business with them too, so I've been searching for them as well as of late. I've been using the bar in order to find information about them. If I had a serving girl, then I'd be able to get more customers and more information. You'll come with me, right? Elizabeth looked shocked at the offer and smiled brightly while exclaiming, yes. Actually, a voice said. This earned the attention of Meliodas and Elizabeth, who both turned to see the woman standing looking at Meliodas with serious looks. We will be coming along as well. Meliodas and Elizabeth both grew confused. Why? Asked Meliodas. Then Naruto stepped forward and said, because we have been looking for the sins in order to see if they would help us find someone. Elizabeth then decided to ask, who are you looking for? Kushina answered this time, we're looking for my son. He was mistakenly banished from our village by my ex-husband simply because of something that he held and for false charges. We want to find him and bring him back home. Why do you think we would be able to help you? Asked Meliodas with a curious yet serious face. Because we received information that the fox's sin of greed, Ban, has the last known location of my son, Naruto. Replied Kushina. This caused Meliodas to go wide-eyed as he then answered, I know that name. Everyone looked at him in surprise. You know Naruto? Asked the group of Kunoichi. Meliodas nodded his head, yeah, Ban used to talk about that name all the time. He told us stories about many adventures that he said were told to him by Naruto. The group grew extremely happy, knowing that they now had a solid lead. So can we come with you? Asked Tenten. Meliodas just smiled and nodded his head saying, sure, I think it'll be fun and amazing to help you guys out. Besides, 1 or 2 of you became serving girls as well and can help cook, that'll also let us get more information. Suddenly, a giant green pig appeared and everyone noticed the boar had on its back along with Hawk, who had run away earlier. Nice timing, Hawk's mom. Exclaimed Meliodas, and then he and everyone else climbed on Hawk's mom. With this everyone looked forward, all of them ready to continue their journey, Elizabeth and Meliodas to find the other 7 sins, and the group of Kunoichi to look for Naruto, but decided to help Elizabeth along the way. None of them knew what was in store for them, but they all knew one thing, no matter what happens on this journey, it was going to be one hell of an adventure. Chapter 2 Burnia Village, the sleeping giant, and a holy knight appears. Borhat. The group had been traveling for a few days now and had made great progress thanks to Hawk's mom taking them while they all rode in the tavern. As they continued on their journey, they all began introducing themselves. Elizabeth properly introduced herself as Elizabeth Lyons, the 3rd princess to the kingdom. Afterwards, the group of Kunoichi all began to introduce themselves as ninja from the elemental nations and that they were searching for leads on Naruto's whereabouts and that they had heard Ban knew the last known location of Naruto. After they all introduced themselves, Meliodas welcomed all of them as official members of the Borhat Bar. Soon after, Elizabeth, Naruto, Hinata, Tenten, and Anko all got changed into the female uniform for the bar, which consisted of a short pink frilly shirt with a black ribbon that exposes their belly buttons and hugs their busts, a dark miniskirt strapped with a pink belt, and a black stocking on the left leg and black and white heels. Anko didn't really care about the outfit, but Naruto, Tenten, and Elizabeth were all very flustered about the design of the outfit and the length of the skirts, but they began to relax when Kushina said she would work on them and change them a little bit for the girls. With this they all sighed in relief. Before anyone could continue however, Meliodas began circling around the 4 of them, checking the uniform to make sure they all okay, when he noticed something that most of the Kunoichi had. Hey, began Meliodas, getting everyone's attention, I just noticed this, but why are some of you wearing necklaces with the same thread? He asked, also gaining Elizabeth's curiosity on the subject. They then saw the group take on sad smiles before Hinata answered. The necklaces were made by Naruto, and only he made these specific necklaces because only he could make the charm and the thread. She said with a soft, sad smile. Meliodas became curious, how come only he could make them? This time Tenten answered, only he could make them because the material for the charms would be imbued with chakra, which is the energy used in the elemental nations, and would make it stronger when finished. However, this made it brittle when it came time to carve and he had experimented several times until he found the right technique to carve them, where he would then begin making jewelry with them. But why is this important? Asked a curious Elizabeth. This is important because the jewelry he made, like these necklaces, became very well known among the village, mainly the women, because of the fact that they shined so brightly, they wouldn't rust or break, and they actually protect the women wearing them from attempted rape and murder, unless they died in combat. However, because of this, many men began to try and find out his techniques in order to be able to carve their own charms so that either they could get women to favor them and get in bed with them or so that they could create their own charms in order to bypass the effects of the jewelry he made. Informed Kushina. Meliodas and Elizabeth finally realized why these necklaces were so important, but then Meliodas asked, but if he made different types of jewelry, how come you girls only have necklaces? Those of the group wearing necklaces pulled the necklace out, but they held the charms in their hands where Meliodas and Elizabeth couldn't see what the charm was. This time, it was Hana who answered. It's because when he made the necklaces we're wearing, he told us that he also added an effect that if we were to ever be at death's door, it would let him know and he would instantly appear before us in order to save us. Hana informed while smiling softly, along with the rest of the Kunoichi, at how thoughtful Naruto was. Meliodas and Elizabeth both smiled as well upon hearing how amazing this Naruto sounded. Then Elizabeth decided to ask Meliodas a question that had been on her mind. Sir Meliodas, began Elizabeth, there's something I wanted to ask you. Meliodas turned to Elizabeth along with the Kunoichi to see what she wanted to ask. Yes. Are you really as much of a villain as everyone says you are? Asked Elizabeth, and if so, what kind of crime did you commit? Asked Elizabeth. This gained the attention of the Kunoichi as well, wanting to know why he was considered a criminal. Well, my crime, began Meliodas, getting the others to lean forward slightly in anticipation at hearing this information, is that 10 years ago I went around Britannia, stealing all in the panties in sight. Informed Meliodas with a straight face. The entire group became flustered, with Elizabeth and Hinata being more so, before they all exclaimed, panties, you're lying. It's a lie. Meliodas said nonchalantly, getting the others to face fault. Actually, I walked around groping the breasts of over 1,000 women. Meliodas then said, still with a straight face. The group began to blush more before they exclaimed, seriously, you're kidding right? Of course, I'm kidding. Meliodas replied nonchalantly again, causing the group to face fault again. Sir Meliodas, please stop making fun of me. Exclaimed a blushing Elizabeth, or is it possible that you can't talk about it? Meliodas then calmly said, something like that. The group then said, huh? But before they could continue any further, the boar hat suddenly began shaking and there was the loud cry of Hawk's mom. The shaking was so severe that Elizabeth would have fallen over if Naruto hadn't held her up, as she and the rest of the Kunoichi stood perfectly fine by sticking to the ground using chakra. However, Meliodas took this chance to make it seem like he slipped and accidentally, and read purposely, fell into Naruto's breasts, which caused her to get flustered and smack Meliodas upside the head with her sheathed katana. Looks like we've arrived. Meliodas said calmly, with a huge lump on his head from Naruto hitting him on the head. Arrived where? Where is here? Asked Anko. The next area where we can get information, Meliodas informed, the village of Burnia. 5 minutes later, we find everyone standing outside, watching in amazement as Hawk's mom began to dig herself underneath the ground until she disappears completely with the boar hat being the only thing in view. Meliodas then looked at the group and decided that Kushina, Satsuki, Hinata, Hawk and Elizabeth would follow him to the village while the rest stay and set up the bar for business later. The 5 of them then left and with that they began their walk into Vanya. As they were walking, Meliodas was informing them about how, even though he fills his bar with alcohol from all over Britannia, the alcohol from Burnia was special due to their spring water that was the best in Britannia, and that with the grout, herbs used in making ale, that grows along the river, it was the best ale around. That was when they realized that the river was all dried up with the herbs wilting. They then noticed all of the people that were gathering in the middle of town, and they believed it was a festival. Hey guys, what's up? Asked Meliodas while walking up, gaining the attention of some of the guys who usually drink at his bar, before he then asked, what's up with this festival today? This was the wrong thing to ask as the men then got angry, does this look like a fucking festival? They shouted before exclaiming, we're trying to pull a sword out that a holy knight stabbed into ground. This confused Meliodas and he muttered to himself, he stabbed it into the ground. Why would he do that? Then an elder came over and informed the group how Holy Knight had been there previously and had brought his wrath down on the village and he imbued the sword with mana before he stabbed it into the ground, locking the water away underground. If this goes on, then we'll lose all of our water and the grout will die out. Exclaimed a random villager. And if that happens, then we won't be able to make any more Burnia ale. Shit. Exclaimed another villager. Why would a Holy Knight do such a thing? Wondered Elizabeth on why a holy knight would do such a thing. Is it that holy knight that you defeated before, Sir Meliodas? I don't think so. Kushina said, gaining Elizabeth's attention. The man from before was able to create whirlwinds when he swung his sword and from I sensed, he could only manipulate wind. This feels different from him. You're right. Agreed Satsuki, now gaining the attention of the others, branching out from where the sword is stabbed are many branches of lighting and electricity that is slowly expanding and is further closing the window for the water to return. Satsuki informed what she sensed from the sword. She's right and that's not all. Began Hinata with a sense of seriousness that she normally doesn't show. You see, ever since Naruto left, she had been getting help from her fellow harem sisters, Hana and Tenten, on how to be more confident, even if for brief moments at times. Along with the electricity, there appears to be a form of a security system where either only someone is stronger than the one who put the sword can remove it or someone who has a very high lightning affinity. At this last part she had sent a subtle look towards Satsuki, who nodded at understanding what Hinata was implying. After the group was done talking, they all turned to see everyone resting and sweating heavily from trying and failing to remove the sword. As everyone was resting, 2 regular knights were sitting on the side laughing at the people for being unable to remove the sword. Then everyone heard a voice begin to shout at everyone. "Hey! What's up with this sad and depressed tone?" This turned out to be the voice of a little boy with hair that is skipped out in the middle like a broom and has a scar on his left cheek. He is wearing a green shirt with yellow triangles lining the end of the sleeve, a light brown cloak tied around his neck, khaki shorts and sandals. The villagers recognize this boy as Mead. "What's so big about a holy knight's sword?" "Don't worry, my friend from the 7 deadly sins will take of it," Mead exclaimed, getting Meliodas, Elizabeth, Kushina, Hinata and Satsuki to look at him in surprise, while the 2 grunt knights grew fearful looks. At least until the villagers started shouting at Mead about how it was his fault that they were in this mess to begin with. Mead began to try and explain how he never meant for this to happen, but the villagers wouldn't hear of it and continued yelling at Mead. As this was going on, Kushina was slowly getting angrier and angrier at the way the villagers were treating Mead. She had enough when they began throwing rocks at Mead, even though they were hitting Meliodas and saying they hate him. She then had Satsuki pick up Mead and begin running with the others, minus herself, Elizabeth and Hawk, following her to the boarhead. As they were running, the village elder was trying to get the people to stop, but they wouldn't listen. "Maybe we came at a bad time," Hawk said, feeling bad about what just happened. He's a good kid, deep down, but the village elder began speaking with Elizabeth and Kushina listening. Back with the others, they had finally made it inside the boarhead and they were now going to find out if Mead was telling the truth about being friends with one of the 7. "Hey kid," Satsuki began, "is what they said back there true?" Mead ignored her, which gained her a tick mark, and simply asked, "Hey, isn't this a bar?" Meliodas answered, "It's my bar, the boarhead." "I'm hungry," Mead exclaimed to Meliodas. "Money?" asked Meliodas. "Nope," replied Mead. "Then I'll feed you once you give me some information," bargained Meliodas. "Food first," exclaimed Mead. 10 minutes later, and sitting in front of Mead was a plate of chicken that has a dollop of garlic butter on top that was melting down the chicken and some water to drink. The others, minus Kushina, Elizabeth and Hawk, were all sitting around at the table or standing near the table, with Meliodas having a drink. "Thanks for food," exclaimed Mead before he began eating and then spit it out because it was still disgusting, seeing as Meliodas was the one who prepared it. When complaining, Meliodas simply told him that he never said Mead would receive bad tasting food. "So is it true that you're friends with one of the 7? Meliodas asked while drinking some alcohol, while the others were leaning forward slightly in anticipation. "That was so disgusting that I forgot," exclaimed Mead, getting the Kunoichi to drop their heads in defeat at not getting anything. Mead then began to smell something that was awfully familiar before he looked at Meliodas in shock before exclaiming, "That's Burnia ale." Then Mead began describing the ale, from its sweet rich taste to the delectable scent of apples. Then Mead exclaimed that it was the best ale ever before he gained a sad look while he began to look slightly down. It was at this time that Elizabeth, Kushina and Hawk all returned. "We heard from the village elder, Mead." Elizabeth while looking at Mead, who exclaimed, "What a woman." And Elizabeth continued, "You're a big prankster, aren't you?" Elizabeth then moved closer to Mead with Kushina beside her, then Elizabeth began, "When I was little, my father scolded me for pulling pranks." Mead just turned his head and exclaimed, "Good for you. Congrats." Elizabeth just smiled and continued, "I wanted his attention because he wasn't my real father." At this Mead and everyone else, minus Kushina and Meliodas, looked surprised by this, and Elizabeth continued, "One time, I climbed the biggest tree in the garden to surprise him. He turned pale and started to climb up after me, even though he had never climbed a tree in his life as expected. He couldn't climb up and fell down and got hurt. I can't forget about what happened. Even now if he had died back then." Elizabeth was interrupted by Mead when he slammed his hands down on the table, looking very scared, before he began to tell everyone how his parents were travelers who had passed away due to an epidemic when they stopped Burnia, and how ever since then, he had been alone. But, the villagers would take care of him and raised him, and that he was really happy, but felt jealous of all the families that could go home together with smiles on their faces, and so he had started to tell lies and pull pranks. He then explained, when Elizabeth asked him, that he had put a worm in the Holy Knight's drink because he had insulted the village's hard work by saying it had only been slightly better than horse urine. The same story Mead tells in the anime and manga. "The Holy Knights are fakes," exclaimed Mead. "So, when you said that one of the 7 were your friend?" asked Meliodas. "It was a lie," Mead confessed sadly. After Mead said that, he felt a hand running through his hair and looked up to see that the owner of the hand was Kushina, who was smiling softly at Mead. "You know, you remind me an awful lot of my son when he was young too," Kushina said while still smiling. This got everyone's attention, especially Naruto's, because she didn't know what her brother was like when he was younger, only that he cared for her and their mother deeply. What was he like? Asked Mead, wanting to hear about this woman's son. Kushina just smiled brightly and looked out the window at the village before she began. He used to be loud and unable to sit still for long periods of time. He would pull pranks and tell jokes and get in trouble for attention. In fact, he once painted the over the monument we have in our village of all the previous and current leaders in broad daylight while purposely wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. At this, Kushina and all the Kunoichi began giggling or laughing remembering that day. Kushina then continued, the best part was that nobody had noticed him doing this until he had purposely began shouting how the villagers were a bunch of idiots and how the village shinobi must have been blind if nobody could see him. Then, he began running as all of the shinobi in our village began chasing him and yet they couldn't catch him, but then he was found by his academy teacher and brought to me. Kushina continued before she then gave a small yet sad smile. I still remember looking at him, covered in paint, with the top part of the jumpsuit unzipped and hanging by his waist, why he had done such a thing. Kushina then turned to Mead and asked, do you know what he told me? Mead just softly shook his head negatively and asked, what did he say? Kushina then replied, he told me that he did it because he wanted a different kind of attention from the villagers. This answer confused Mead, Elizabeth, Hawk, and even Meliodas. Why would he want a different kind of attention? What was he receiving? Asked Elizabeth. Kushina then grew a frown that showed her anger, disappointment and sadness. When he was growing up, he was made fun of for looking different than me and his father, but he was also hated and treated horribly by the villagers because of an event that had happened during his birth that he had no control over. What happened? Asked Mead, who was feeling sadness at how her son was treated, with Elizabeth and Hawk feeling horror at how adults could treat a child. Kushina then went on to explain how during Naruto's birth, their village was attacked by a fierce demon known as the Kyuubi no Yoko. This earned fearful looks from Elizabeth, Hawk, and Mead. Kushina then continued to explain how the shinobi of the village couldn't defeat such a powerful creature, and so her ex-husband had convinced the previous leader to assist him in sealing away the demon. However, because it was so powerful, no non-living object would hold it and so they sealed half inside of her ex-husband and the other inside of her son. This caused a trio of Elizabeth, Hawk, and Mead to all gain looks of horror, while Meliodas started to look angry at what the villagers did and then great sadness when Kushina explained how her ex-husband told the village of his status of being the demon's jailer, but the villagers had looked at him as if he was the demon itself and thus treated him terribly, but when their daughter was revealed to be the same, 3 years later when her ex-husband couldn't hold his half of the demon anymore and transferred it into her body, she was greeted as a hero. This caused everyone to get angry looks on their faces at how bigoted people are. Mead looked frustrated and sad, then he said, people like that are terrible, and the Holy Knights are no different. That's why I told everyone that I was friends with one of the 7 deadly sins, because if the Holy Knights are afraid of anything, it would be them. Once Mead said this, everyone just slowly turned to Meliodas who was drinking alcohol when he noticed everyone looking at him and said, what? Everyone then began to hear a commotion from the village and decided to head down there with Mead taking off to the village. Once they got close enough, they understood what was going on because the knights had begun announcing that if the village couldn't remove the sword soon, then they would increase the taxes. The people started complaining and began to blame Mead again, when the elder exclaimed that he had had enough of their blaming Mead, when all he did was express how everyone else was feeling. The village suddenly got extremely worked up and began trying even harder to remove the sword by pulling on ropes they had tied to the sword. Then Mead joined in, but the sword just wouldn't budge. They were trying and pulling so hard that they started to tear open their hands from the strength in their grip while the rope began to run through their hands. As this was going on, the grunt knights from before were just sitting on the side drinking the village's ale while laughing at the people. As they were about to toast their cups, they found the cups missing and in Meliodas' hand, with him saying that those who don't understand the taste of alcohol shouldn't drink it at all. The villagers had all fallen to the floor, sweating and panting like crazy from all of the effort they put in. As they were doing this, Meliodas was walking to the sword while finishing off the drinks he had taken from the knights. When he finished he put the cups on the floor and said, that was good, but unfortunately, I don't have anything to pay you guys with. As he said this he took a hold of the sword handle, then asked, so, how about this? And with that Meliodas pulled the sword out of the ground with everyone looking at him in shock at how easily he pulled the sword out. Then there was a rumbling noise coming from underground and right where the grunt knights were sitting, the water just suddenly exploded outward, causing the villagers to shout in excitement and joy about the water being back. Everyone began celebrating about having the water back and the Kunoichi and Elizabeth were all smiling at the villagers' happy faces. The grunt knights, who finally came down from being launched into the air, were on the floor gathering their thoughts when Meliodas came over still holding the sword over his shoulder and said, get out of here. The two grunt knights then took off, running away in fear, with the people still celebrating. As Meliodas was still watching the knights run, with the sword still on his shoulder, Mead came up to him and began to ask, "Hey, could you really be?" But then Meliodas interrupted him, "Yep. I am the proud owner of a fine drinking establishment known as the Boar Hat." Mead then tried to say what he meant, but Meliodas continued by asking, "Anyways, don't you have something to do?" At this Mead turned around to see all of the villagers looking at him with apologetic looks, and then they began to apologize to Mead and asking if he could forgive them, but Mead tried to look tough until Meliodas gave him a gentle push forward, and that was when Mead ran to the villagers with tears falling. As Mead began running, Meliodas said, "No matter what lies you make up, you can't lie to your heart." Then he got a sad look on his face, which was not missed by the Kunoichi or Elizabeth. But then they were all surrounded by the villagers expressing their gratitude and saying that they should all celebrate. Meanwhile at Fort Solgales, a knight is seen informing a holy knight about what occurred at the village. The holy knight is a young man with short, slightly curled pink hair and blue eyes. He is wearing a dark-colored full bodysuit of armor and has a single-handed sword at his side. The upper part of the armor has several crosses and the symbol of the holy knights carved into it. He also had a leather belt tied around his waist. This is Holy Knight Gilthander, and he doesn't seem to be impressed by what he is hearing. Back at the Boar Hat, we find all of the villagers celebrating getting their water back and being free of the holy knights, if only temporary. Off to the side, we find Elizabeth being nervous about something. "How can I really do this? It's my first time doing something like this. My heart is pounding," Elizabeth said while looking embarrassed. Hinata was no better and said, "Me too." Meliodas simply began nodding his head up and down. I see, can you two say that again?" Meliodas said while leaning in with a slight blush and steam puffing out of his nose at least until he was smacked upside the head by Naruto's sword still in its sheath and a frying pan being wielded by Kushina, both having glowing eyes and their hair floating while looking like nine tails. "Get your head out of the gutter," exclaimed Naruto. "Please behave yourself around these young women, Meliodas," Kushina said. "Anyways," began Meliodas, while having two still steaming lumps on his head, "you'll be fine as waitresses until you get a better hang of it. Getting information only the seven is important, yes, but so is getting information on the Holy Knights and what they're up to. Anyways, that's it for the serious talk, just get out there and do your best you four." With this, Elizabeth, Naruto, Hinata, Tenten, and Anko all said, "Right." With that, the five of them began serving the villagers while also trying to get information on any of the seven deadly sins, as well as the Holy Knights. Anko was able to get the hang of waiting people and collecting information easily. Naruto and Tenten took a little longer because they had never really served people before, but they eventually got the hang of it. Hinata as well took even longer because of her nervousness around people not being completely gone, but she eventually got it. Elizabeth, however, she really showed that she had never waited people before as she kept getting orders wrong, dropping meals, and slipping on things. Eventually she slipped again, but this time, she ran outside with tears flowing down her face. When she ran outside, Meliodas and Naruto both suddenly felt an enormous amount of power heading in their direction. Meliodas was about to head outside, but Naruto looked at him and shook her head, saying she would handle it and Elizabeth. Once outside, Naruto was looking at the sky, trying to figure out where the energy was aiming specifically, when she heard sniffling and saw Elizabeth crying with her head in her knees. She then stood in a specific spot when she finally found where it was going to pass and stood there ready before she turned to Elizabeth and said, "Not everyone has an easy time doing something for the first time, you know." Elizabeth then turned her head towards Naruto and said, "I know that, but I'm just useless. I can't get the orders right. I break all of the plates and cups and I can't even get information that helps us. When I thought I had something about the Holy Knights, it just turned out to be about some forest that they avoid, which doesn't do us any good." Elizabeth finished, feeling depressed about all of the mistakes she made. "It's laughable a useless waitress wants to protect the people of this country." Naruto was quiet for a second before, "When I started out being a kunoichi, I made a lot mistakes, I was loud, I missed details on missions that led my team to failing, and when I was little, I got frustrated at being unable to do a technique like my mom and ran into the forest getting lost. But, whenever I got upset or sad or felt useless, I would always remember what my Nai-san would say." Naruto told Elizabeth, getting her to look at her and ask, "What did he say?" Naruto then began to softly smile at the memory of her Nai-san, giving her one of the most important lessons she would ever learn. Flashback, 7 years ago. The 9-year-old Naruto had been running through the forest, upset at failing to understand how to do her mom's adamantine chains again. She had been running for almost half an hour when she realized that she didn't know which way to go back home. She began to get scared and cry because it was dark in the forest and she was afraid of the dark. Suddenly, she heard something further out in the forest. "Ho." At first it sounded faint, but as she began to move in the direction, it began to get louder and more clear until she realized something. Naruto. It was her name being called out and she began to shout, "I'm here. Help. Over here." 5 minutes after she shouted, she began to hear rustling in the bushes in front of her and began to get frightened again. She thought it was a ferocious animal that had hurt her and was coming to eat her before help could arrive. Then, the rustling got louder and she closed her eyes thinking she was a goner until Naruto. She heard the voice shout in surprise and relief, which got her to look and see her Nai-san there, bent over with his hands on his knees, panting, showing that he had been running around looking for her. Then he looked up at her with a smile and said, "There you are. Let's get you home." 5 minutes later, we find Naruto walking through the forest with Naruto on his back, then Naruto decided to talk, "What were you thinking? You could have gotten hurt or worse. Running off into the forest at this time." "I'm sorry," muttered Naruto, "I was just upset." Upset about what?" exclaimed Naruto. Naruto began to cry as she dug her head into his back and said, "I couldn't do mom's chains again. I keep trying and I never get it. Maybe I'm just useless." Naruto finally understood what the problem was and sighed before speaking, "You're not useless, you know." Naruto then felt Naruto bring her head out and this told him he had her attention, so he continued, "You should never consider yourself useless, because nothing is useless. Just look at me, I've only been a shinobi for a little over a year and I've made lots of mistakes. At one point, I began to think like you and thought I, myself, were useless." At this, Naruto looked at her Nai-san in shock before he continued, "But then I realized, I may think of myself as useless, but that just means it isn't my time to shine yet. Once it becomes my time, I will do my best to shine brighter than everybody else, because if I'm useless, then that means I can't protect what's precious to me." At this time, the duo had finally made it out of the forest and could see the village up ahead. Then, Naruto put Naruto down, kneeled in front of her and said, "I want you to make me a promise," getting Naruto to focus on him. "In the future, I may not always be here to help you out of your funk, so I want you to remember these next words that I tell you." Naruto then saw her Nai-san look at her with such love, courage and determination that she knew no matter what happened next, she would never forget it. Present. Naruto then looked at Elizabeth and said, "He told me, should you ever begin to feel useless and that you can't do anything right, I want you to remember that I will always believe in you, no matter what you do or how many times you fail, and if that's not enough, then believe in the me that believes in you." This got Elizabeth to look at Naruto with wide eyes, then Naruto said, "So, just like my Nai-san said, if you can't believe in yourself, then believe in the me and the others who believe in you." This got Elizabeth to begin crying at hearing someone believes in her, and besides, that information about the forest may be something, so that means you aren't useless. Elizabeth then nodded her head and said with a big smile and tears flowing down her face, "Right." Naruto smiled and nodded before she turned back to the direction she had been facing before with a serious face and said, "Good. And right now, I'll show what all of that hard work achieved." Elizabeth then watched as 4 chains came out of Naruto's back. They were light purple and looked to be permeating with power, and at the end of each chain was what looked like spearheads. Then Elizabeth looked in the direction Naruto was facing and saw what looked like a spear surrounded by lightning heading right for them. Naruto then surrounded her right arm in chains and formed a hand on the end and raised it with the hand open. And then, right as it passed Naruto, she grabbed it with her hand, but the power and force behind it caused her to shoot off in the direction of the town. Elizabeth then shouted, "Naruto." In shock, as she watched one of her fellow travelers shooting off towards the village and begin to crash through several buildings before she finally managed to stop the spear, but her right sleeve had been destroyed from the power of the lightning. Then she spun the spear around and threw it back in the direction it came from, while adding some of the Kyuubi's chakra to add power and speed, which caused the spear to look as if it was on fire with some purple due to the chains, and began to pump chakra into her own arm as well to strengthen her throw. The spear then flew off into the distance while giving the anime twinkle in the sky. And think what Team Rocket does in Pokemon when they blast off. Back at Fort Solgales, Gilthunder was going through some paperwork when he felt it. Then coming from the direction of the village was the same spear which then crashed into the chair Gilthunder was using, but the force from the throw caused the entire fort to receive cracks all over the building. Then when the dust cleared, it revealed Gilthunder to not have moved, except for moving his head to the left a bit and suffered a small cut. The spear was embedded in the chair and still looked to be on fire, as the last of Kyuubi's chakra left the spear, along with the purple energy from the chains. Gilthunder was surprised by this energy and said, "Well now, who are you? And are you with Meliodas?" Back at the village everyone was watching as Naruto undid the chains covering her arm to show that it was perfectly fine, if just a bit red on the hand from the amount of lightning. The others ran up to her and began to check on her, to which she was embarrassed on how they reacted and said she was fine, before Elizabeth asked, "Was that from the Holy Knight who put the sword in the village?" Meliodas then answered, "Probably." Naruto then said, "It might be better for the village if we were to leave." Elizabeth looked shocked at the suggestion and exclaimed, "But what if the Holy Knight attacks the village again?" It would be more dangerous if we were to stay here, besides, thanks to you, we now have a new place to go and check," answered Naruto while having her hand bandaged. Elizabeth was confused. "What do you mean? I didn't get any information," she exclaimed. Naruto simply chuckled and looked at Elizabeth before saying, "But you did remember the information about this forest that the Holy Knights avoid. And besides, what are we supposed to be doing anyways?" Elizabeth looked at Naruto with confusion for a second and then she got a big smile and said, "Find the 7 deadly sins." It has now been almost a week since the group left Burnia village and they are now traveling through a forest. However, this forest had no signs of life and was covered in a thick white fog. This forest was known as the Forest of White Dreams and currently the entire group was walking together through the forest. Elizabeth then began climbing up some roots with the of Naruto and said, "It's been almost 3 hours since we entered the forest, but I haven't seen a single person or animal. I only see trees and their dead branches and I'm getting sick of it." "Oink," said Hawk. "Could one of the 7 really be here, Meliodas?" asked Elizabeth. Before he could answer, Kushina beat him to it. "It is possible, Elizabeth, after all, with all of this fog and the vastness of it, this could be the best place to hide." "That may be true, but I heard rumors of monsters living here." "Oink," said Hawk while being slightly scared. Anna came up to Hawk and began to rub his head while saying, "It's okay, Hawk, nothing is going to get you while we're here to help." This got Hawk to calm down, at least until he heard Elizabeth scream. This got the group to grip their weapons, with some pulling out kunai and Naruto, Satsuki and Kushina pulling out their swords, ready for a fight. Until they turned around and saw Meliodas groping Elizabeth's butt, which promptly got him smacks from the kunoichi. Meliodas then began talking, despite the numerous lumps on his head from the kunoichi, about how because the forest is covered by the fog all year round, that traveling by horse would be difficult and that it would be easy to lose your sense of direction and how even hunters avoid this forest, thus making it an ideal hiding spot from the Holy Knights. Suddenly, Elizabeth realized something was different about herself right now. This caused her to wonder what happened, which did not go unnoticed by the others. Naruto then asked Elizabeth if she was alright, which got Elizabeth to blush like crazy and reply that she was fine. Her response was met with some suspicion but was otherwise ignored. "Hey you guys. Hurry up already. Don't you know that monsters always attack when the people are messing around?" exclaimed Hawk. "Calm down, Hawk," said Meliodas, "no one likes a paranoid piglet." "Who a paranoid piglet?" came the reply of multiple voices at the same time, which got the group to turn and see that there were now multiple Hawks. The group was surprised to see something like this. Elizabeth asked if this was the work of the monster in the forest and Meliodas simply said that Hawk must have been right about a monster and that it was pretty crazy. All of the Hawks began to ask the group for help while also saying that they each were fakes before telling the group to do something. While the group were trying to think on what to do, Meliodas solved everything. By beating up every single Hawk there. The group looked surprised at the sudden bout of violence, with Elizabeth shouting in worry for Hawk. Then all of the Hawks ran behind Elizabeth while complaining about how even Hawk's mother doesn't hit him. Elizabeth got worried about Hawk and turned around to make sure he was okay, but when she turned around, she came face to face with a copy of herself. Suddenly, more and more copies came out. Before there were several copies of Elizabeth all saying they were the real one, but the group just couldn't figure out which was the real one. The Elizabeth copies then moved forward and tried to attack the group, but the Kunoichi and Meliodas all disappeared and then reappeared by the Elizabeths. Meliodas then told the Elizabeths that they had to listen to everything he said. He took advantage of this and had all of the Elizabeths grope their own breasts after getting them to say his name with an embarrassed and put their right hand up with their left hand on their cheek. When the Kunoichi saw this, they all smacked him upside the head with their fists or their weapons that were still in their sheaths. Meliodas then said, with several lumps on his head, "This is the last test, jump as high as you can." The Kunoichi were confused at this request until they saw all of the Elizabeths jump except for one, who crouched down to the floor while holding down her skirt with a bright blush on her face. Meliodas then charged forward at a rapid pace and attacked all of the Elizabeths that were in the air, who then fell to the ground and exploded into a plume of smoke. Once the smoke cleared, it revealed a bunch of small, ugly creatures with blue skin and warts while wearing cloaks to cover their bodies and boots, who were all running away, deeper into the forest. "What were those things?" exclaimed Naruto, with the other Kunoichi wondering the same thing. "Those were prankster imps known as hide-and-seeks," informed Hawk. They began chase after them when Meliodas said to do so, but then also smacked him again when he revealed that he had taken Elizabeth's panties. As the group was chasing them, they saw the imps running to what looked like a little girl who was curled up, sleeping. This got the group to begin running faster, thinking the imps were going to attack the girl. At least until they got closer and saw that the little girl, in fact, wasn't so little. She looked to be 30 feet tall, had brown hair that was tied up in twin tails, and a well-endowed curvaceous body. She was wearing short-sleeved one-piece orange jumpsuit, matching colored boots with 5 crossed laces that reach up to her knees, and 2 fingerless gauntlets of a blue-gray leathery material covered in shiny steel studs. The final thing that the group noticed was the serpent symbol that was on her left thigh. The group then noticed the imps go up to the sleeping girl and say, "Lollar Diane. We've allowed a group of holy knights to come through. Please forgive us." At this, the newly named Diane's eyes snapped open, she stood up, and before the group could do anything, Meliodas and Naruto were snatched up in her hands with her wondering, "Holy knights. Hey giant woman, are you going to eat Meliodas and Naruto?" exclaimed Hawk. "Please let Sir Meliodas and Naruto go," exclaimed Elizabeth. "May I ask that you let my daughter go, please?" asked Kushina, while readying her weapon along with the other Kunoichi, who were ready to attack at a moment's notice. Diane looked at the two in her hands before focusing on Meliodas and squinted her eyes in focus while wondering out loud, "Meliodas?" Meliodas simply said, "Hey Diane. How have you been these past 10 years?" Diane stared at Meliodas in concentration for a second before she grew extremely happy and exclaimed, "Captain." Happy at seeing her captain again after 10 years. Hawk, Elizabeth, and the rest of the group were surprised to find out that this was Diane of the 7 deadly sins, with Hawk exclaiming, Diane. You mean this giant is one of the 7, the sin of envy, Diane?" Diane looked and saw Hawk and thought that Meliodas brought her food because she loved whole roasted pig, but that was fervently declined. Diane then looked over towards Naruto and asked, "So who are you?" Naruto then introduced herself, "Hello, my name is Naruto, and me and my fellow Kunoichi along with Elizabeth there are traveling with Meliodas in order to find the 7 deadly sins." Diane then put them both down and asked, "Really? Why would you be looking for us?" Elizabeth then answered, "I am looking for the 7 because I wish for their help in stopping the Holy Knights." Diane nodded her head in understanding before looking over to the Kunoichi group, who had finally relaxed after Naruto was released, and asked, "So, what about you guys? Why are you looking for us?" Kushina answered and said, "We actually aren't looking for all of you per se, but more the sin of greed, Ban." "Okay, but why are you looking for him?" asked Diane, with Meliodas answering. "Remember all those stories that Ban used to tell us that he was told by this person named Naruto?" he asked, getting a nod from Diane at her remembering. Well, it turns out that he was falsely banished from their village by her ex-husband, who was also their previous leader, and Ban, apparently, knows the last location that Naruto was. He continued, while pointing at Kushina when mentioning her ex-husband. "Oh yeah?" exclaimed Diane, "I remember those stories. I always loved listening to those stories." Diane then asked, "What did your son look like and why did your ex-husband banish him?" Meliodas told her that Naruto is actually the one who Ban based his looks off of, and then Kushina supported the identification, before she went on to explain about the Kyuubi and the years growing up, along with the charges that were later revealed to be false, when her ex-husband was arrested and executed, along with the corrupt civilian council and the advisors. During the explanation, Diane looked upset at the villagers for treating Naruto like that, and sad at what happened. "And then, when we first heard about Ban knowing his last location, we trained my daughter for the past 3 years to get stronger, and then we left for Britannia. From there, we looked around and tried to gather information on the 7, Ban, or Naruto, until we ended up at Meliodas' bar, where we ran into Elizabeth and found out Meliodas was one of the 7 when defending Elizabeth from a Holy Knight apprentice. From there, we helped Burnia village where we got information about a forest that the Holy Knights avoid, and the rest is history." Kushina finished, getting Diane to look at the Kunoichi in admiration at all that they could do, as during the explanation, they each gave brief descriptions of what they could. "Wow!" exclaimed Diane with stars in her eyes, "You guys sound amazing for humans." This got the Kunoichi to chuckle, giggle, and laugh, along with Elizabeth, at seeing such a big girl act like such a little kid. Meliodas then decided to say, "Hey Diane, about what happened 10 years ago." Diane caught on and asked, "The day we were summoned by the Great Holy Knight, right?" Meliodas nodded before saying, "I have almost no memory from that day." This got not only Diane, but the entire group to be surprised at someone not remembering anything. Meliodas then goes on to explain what he remembers on that day up until he doesn't anymore. And exactly the same as in the anime and manga. "When I woke up, I was in a hole somewhere. That's actually where I met Hawk," Meliodas said. "Do you think one of the 7 is a traitor and framed us for the murder of the Great Holy Knight?" asked Diane. "I dunno, that's why I'm looking for them, to try and find out what happened. But the one who will definitely remember is Ban. He somehow kept track of everything that happens around him, even when he drinks himself unconscious and can't remember, he does." Diane nodded her head agreeing with Meliodas about Ban. Then she lightly blushed remembering Ban and how kind and helpful he was to her. "Alright. I, the serpent sin of envy, Diane, will lend you my strength," exclaimed Diane. This got the group to exclaim in happiness and joy at getting another sin to help them along the journey. However, before they could begin moving out of the forest, they all heard Hawk exclaim, Eyes. Look up. The group looked up to see a massive thundercloud when suddenly, several bolts of lightning came down and wrapped around everyone, paralyzing them in place. Then they heard someone stepping into the clearing with them, and when they looked they saw Gilthander, who said, "So you are alive, Meliodas." The group were all looking calm, except for Hawk and Elizabeth, who were struggling against their bonds, and Elizabeth exclaimed, "Gilthander, what are you doing here?" "Gilthander?" wondered Meliodas. "He's the holy knight Gilthander. He's a holy knight that's very close to the king my father," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Gilthander?" Meliodas wondered again, "Where have I heard that name from? He always took care of me like a real little sister, he's like a big brother to me," exclaimed Elizabeth. Then Naruto decided to ask, "Hey, this lightning, the sealed river in Burnia, and the attempt to wipe it out, that was all you, right?" "Naruto? That's a terrible thing to say. He's not the kind of person who would do such." Elizabeth shouted at Naruto before she saw Gilthander's face and grew scared when she saw the evil look he had and the feeling of malice he exuded. "This is the same feeling from Burnia, it's a lie, right? You can't be," she exclaimed with fear in her voice. "Elizabeth," Gilthander began, "the kingdom's top priority is to ensure your safety. But that's got nothing to do with me. Whether you live or die is like a grain of sand in the path to the Holy Knight's rule." Gilthander explained before, with a wave of his hand, he released the electric bindings on Elizabeth. "Leave. I only have business with the sins and the one who threw my spear back at me." The Kunoichi tensed until Elizabeth then moved in front of the two sins, the Kunoichi and Hawk, stating, "I won't let you lay a hand on them. Release your spell and let them go." This got everyone to look at Elizabeth in shock at her bravery before Hawk toppled over. "I'm finished." Elizabeth ran over to Hawk and crouched down and said, "Hang on, Hawk." Before he was kicked away with a loud eink. By Gilthander. The group was shocked by this, before Meliodas had a blade with a rounded end at his neck being held by Gilthander, who was behind him. Gilthander then asked Meliodas, "Do you know why we're after your heads?" "I dunno," was all Meliodas said. "Some say it's because the Holy Knights want to purge the traitorous knights who tried to overthrow the kingdom." Gilthander said, "While others are looking to increase their prestige and prove their strength by fighting the legendary seven." "Oh yeah?" exclaimed Naruto, "and which might you be?" Gilthander simply said, "Both." Then he explained, "Revenge for the death of my father, the great holy knight Zarathustra, who was called the strongest holy knight. And, by killing the seven, I can prove I am stronger and surpassed my father." Meliodas then exclaimed, "Now I remember. Your little Gil. The little kid who always followed us around, saying he wanted to be just like us." All with a smile. Then Meliodas exclaimed, "You sure have grown." Gilthander then appeared in front of Meliodas and said, "That was in the past. I am now stronger than any of you since." "Maybe," said Meliodas, "but you don't know for sure." Gilthander thought for a second, "Then I will release you and we'll see." Gilthander said, getting ready to release the spell. Meliodas simply said, "Don't worry about it." And with that, Meliodas and Diane simply spread their arms open a bit, and when they looked at the Kunoichi, they saw them be covered in smoke before revealing logs in their places, and then they came out from the shadows of the trees. This got Diane to look at them with stars in her eyes again and exclaim, "Cool." Getting the Kunoichi to chuckle at her reaction before she turned back to Gilthander with a calm face and waited with her hands on her hips. Meliodas and the Kunoichi were stretching, seeing as they were bound for a good few minutes, and Meliodas said, "I could have broken out of there whenever I wanted if I felt like it. I could wipe out you and this entire forest if I felt like it." Gilthander said, I doubt it. That's impossible." Meliodas said with a cheeky grin. Gilthander paused before saying, "Then I'll kill you." "Right back at you," Meliodas responded. Gilthander then looked to the Kunoichi and said, "When I am done with him, I will find out which of you threw my spear back." "Doubt it," said Anko, getting the Kunoichi to chuckle again. "Besides, I'm pretty sure you won't beat him anyways." Gilthander then heard Meliodas say, "Diane, don't interfere." With Diane replying, "Okay, Captain." They both got ready, with Gilthander putting his left foot forward and sword ready to strike, and Meliodas put his right foot forward right next Gilthander's with his arms relaxed. Gilthander asked, "Too embarrassed to lose a fight, even if it's 2 against 1? Meliodas simply replied, "Don't you get it? I'm trying to be polite." Gilthander then brought his sword down and struck using a huge amount of lightning before he noticed it be countered and sent back at him by Meliodas' ability, full counter. "Didn't I say?" asked Meliodas, "Right back at you." Gilthander then appeared behind Meliodas, showing he dodged a rebounded lightning and said, "Didn't I say?" He then slashed Meliodas' shoulder and continued, "I'll kill you." Diane simply looked on with slight worry now visible along with the Kunoichi and Elizabeth when Meliodas was struck and began falling to the ground. After he hit the ground, Gilthander looked down at him and said, "Meliodas, the dragon sin of wrath, any last words?" Meliodas then weakly began speaking, the other 7, the rest of our group, I wanted to know where they are." Gilthander obliges Meliodas and says, "Very well. Of the remaining 5, we don't know the whereabouts of 3, but we already know where the other 2 are. Gilfinder said before continuing, the fox's sin of greed is imprisoned his base dungeon, and the grizzly's sin of sloth perished in the capital of the dead. Gilfinder revealed. Meliodas continued to lie on the ground for a little longer, looking weak and about to die, before he snapped his eyes open and exclaimed, "Thanks." With a smile. Meliodas then jumped to his feet and mused over the information out loud while still crouching, so, the fox is in base dungeon, and the grizzly is in the capital of the dead. He then stood up and said, "Thanks little Gil. I'll make sure to pay them a visit." Gilfinder then understood what Meliodas did. "I see. You purposely allowed yourself to get hurt and feigned weakness in order to find out about the others." "Yup. So, we'll have to continue this another time, alright?" Meliodas said. Gilfinder then said, "As if I let you go." And attempted to strike Meliodas but was wrapped in glowing purple chains. He looked back and saw one of the kunoichi with red hair holding him with the chains coming out of her back. He checked the chains and remembered the purple energy on the spear and asked, "So, you're the one who threw my spear back?" "That's right," exclaimed Naruto. Gilfinder tried to get out of the chains using his magic, but it didn't appear, which surprised him until Naruto said, "There's no point in trying to break free or use your magic, as these chains seal it away, as long as you're wrapped in them." Naruto then tossed him up and yelled, "Batter up." Which got Diane to pick up a tree and hold it over her shoulder before she swung at Gilfinder, launching him into the air, when Gilfinder channeled his lightning magic through the tree to Diane in an effort to damage her, but did nothing except destroy her gloves along with the tree. At this time, Hawk came running back with scratches and burns, shouting about how he was going to beat up Gilfinder until he realized that Gilfinder was gone. Elizabeth then asked, "Sir Meliodas, what about your wound?" Meliodas shrugged it off and said, "It's no big deal." However, before he could begin moving, he was hit with some senbon needles in the left arm and left leg before Meliodas simply fell over. Diane, Elizabeth and Hawk were surprised by this and looked towards the rest of their group and saw Hinata with veins slowing retreating back, showing she had just used her Byakugan and was handing Tenten the rest of the senbon needle she threw. Diane got mad and shouted, "What are you doing? Why would you attack the captain?" With Elizabeth wondering the same thing. "Because he was injured and it was necessary," said Hana while moving towards Meliodas, with her hands taking something from her ninja pouches, before she was grabbed by Diane, who was glaring at her and slightly squeezing her, causing her some pain, which got her to twitch. The rest of the kunoichi got their weapons ready and tensed. Satsuki then shouted, "Let her go." Diane looked at her and said, "No, she was going to kill the captain, and you guys attacked him. So, why should I do as you say?" "Because he isn't dead, just temporarily paralyzed so that he can be treated," shouted Kurenai, getting Diane to look at Meliodas, who was still awake, and said, "Yeah, I'm fine Diane. I just can't move right now." Diane then opened her hand and saw that Hana had some bandages, string, needles and medicine to clean, stitch and wrap the wound. This got Diane to look sheepish and put Hana down before apologizing, "Sorry about that. It's just that the way you said that and the sudden attack made me think you guys were enemies who had been pretending to be allies." The kunoichi relaxed and put away their weapons before smiling, with Kushina replying, "It's okay. We understand, it's just we have a lot of knuckle-headed people in our village and my son used to be the same, where he would receive a wound but wouldn't treat it until he passed out after completing the mission or when there was a big enough break and we had to treat him." This got the group to smile at the times Naruto would act tough but then pass out from blood loss after the mission was completed. The Sins, however, looked surprised at how tenacious someone could be. This also got them thinking about Ban and how he used to be the same. This made the two Sins go wide-eyed, which was missed by the kunoichi as they were talking at what they were thinking and looked at each other and saw they were thinking the same thing. Could Ban possibly know where Naruto is because he is in fact Ban? The group is now back on the road, with a patched-up Meliodas currently riding Diane's shoulder, holding up Ban's and King's wanted posters, while saying, "The fox's sin was thrown into a dungeon, and the grizzly's sin is presumed dead and buried." What do you think, Diane? Well, if it is true that King is dead, then I say we check it out after getting Ban. Because there would be no point to going to the capital of the dead, completely passing base dungeon, which by the way is closer, and then finding out the rumor was true, and before needing to head back to base, wasting more time to find the others. Diane said with a light shrug, so as to not throw off Meliodas and not jolt him too much to irritate his bandaged wound. It will also be best to head to the village first, as that way we can get a proper doctor to check on that wound and make sure it's okay and nothing is wrong with it," said Hana, who, while confident in her skills as a medic, she was still only a veterinarian. Meliodas nodded his head and said, "Alright. Then let's go pick up Ban at base dungeon." The others shouting in agreement, with only Meliodas and Diane thinking, and to confirm if Ban is really this Naruto person we've been hearing about. Base dungeon. Ban was awake and humming while he was being tortured, completely unfazed by their attempts to cause him suffering. While they were in the middle of grabbing some other blades, he suddenly sneezed, which got the torturers to look at him as he sniffed and shrugged his shoulders as best he could while pinned with steel spikes. He then went back to humming and thought, why did I sneeze? Am I getting sick? But I never get sick. Dan then got a look of realization before he made a sly smile as best he could and thought with glee, someone must be talking about me, but who? It can't be that cute blue-haired knight who I see pass by and give orders of the guard change. So it must be the others remembering me. Dan then got a look of glee, which, because the torturers were watching him, they thought he wanted a specific tool, so they grabbed it and moved towards him to continue. Ban, however, didn't care about the torture and instead was excited about meeting the other again because he had this feeling something exciting would happen soon. Chapter 3: The Weird Fangs and Reunion. It has been a week since the group found Diane and fought against Gilthander. Currently, the group was on their way to Dalmary Town, which was a couple miles outside of Base Dungeon, where the Fox's Sin of Greed was held. Right now, we see the women of the group taking a break outside with Diane talking to the Kunoichi about other abilities and things they can do with Meliodas inside the boar hat room, resting by force due to a paralysis seal that was placed on him to keep him in bed. So you guys use this chakra to perform abilities and techniques such as breathing fireballs, walking on water, and creating those chains of yours? Diane asked with stars in her eyes, excited at hearing more about what the Kunoichi can do. Kushina nodded and said, yeah, but the chains are more mine and my daughter's abilities. Diane was confused, why is that? How come only you two can do that? Naruto was the one who took over from here. You see, in the elemental nations, there are some people who have special abilities that only their clan can use. We call abilities like this Kekkei Genkai or bloodline limit, and basically it makes it where only specific people and their families have a unique ability or skill. Our chains are a part of our clan's Kekkei Genkai, and so only me, my mom, and others from our clan can use them. Another example would be that some people from the elemental nations gain a mixed elemental chakra that allows them to use different elements other than water, wind, earth, fire, and lightning. One such element is the Bakuten, or the explosion release, which is a mix of earth and lightning chakra, allows the user to create explosions through different means, such as an explosive material that they create from their bodies that causes powerful explosions, or they can add an explosion to their attacks when using taijutsu or hand-to-hand combat for more damage. At hearing this, Diane got stars in her eyes again while imagining herself with explosions coming from her hands. Diane shook her head and then turned back and asked, what else can you guys do? Hana decided to then take over from here. Well, some other things we can do is form contract summoning animals, like frogs, dogs, and hawks being some. That doesn't sound too impressive, to be honest. Diane said while looking not very excited about that. Hana and the rest just laughed at her reaction. Well, began Hana, I can understand when you just hear that we can summon animals, but you see, the animals are different sizes and can be the size of our hands to being as big as you. At this, Diane's eyes went wide before she then heard, sometimes also, depending on which species it is, they can also be bigger than you. Diane then began imagining a dog the same size as her and then got the stars again. Now that sounds cool. Diane exclaimed. The Kunoichi laughed at how excited Diane was about hearing what they can do. Anko then began, along with it we can also use Genjutsus or illusions, we can also enhance our strength and speed by channeling chakra to our limbs, and with seals, we can do almost anything. As Anko was describing each ability, Diane was thinking about each one. When she heard about how they can cast illusions, she wasn't really sure how to feel about that one. When she heard about being able to enhance their strength, Diane thought that was pretty cool, since that would mean they could be stronger, depending on how much they channel. However, the last part is what really interested her. Wait, you can do anything with these seals of yours? Diane asked, with a question in mind. Anko seemed to think about that, well, almost anything. There are some things that we can't do with seals, like living forever and such, but yeah, most things should be possible. Diane then looked nervous before she asked, could seals help make me smaller? The Kunoichi were surprised at this request before they all looked at Kushina, who was deep in thought, mumbling some stuff that was missed, before she looked at Diane, who had a look of nervousness and slight hope, and asked, before I answer that, I need to know. Diane nodded her head, ready to answer the questions. Why do you want to be smaller? Diane then sighed while having a look of sadness. It's because in the past, I always wanted to be able to experience some of the things that humans experience without scaring everyone off. I want to be able to walk among you guys without the fear of stepping on one of you. Diane began to get tears in her eyes, also to be able to show him how much I like him. This last part she muttered, hoping no one would hear. However, unknown to Diane, Kushina and Hana heard what she said, and both smiled at such a poor reason. Well, in that case, how could I possibly say no? Kushina said with a smile, getting Diane to brighten up with tears still in her eyes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Diane began saying over and over, incredibly happy at being able to be smaller. The Kunoichi all smiled at how happy Diane looked at hearing that she could be smaller. Now, I will begin working on it right away so that you can have it as soon as possible. Also, do you want it where you can change your size at will? Kushina asked, with her answer being Diane nodding her head up and down rapidly like a little kid. Yes. That would be so useful. Diane exclaimed. Alright, well, I better get to work and we had better keep on moving if we want to make it to Dalmary town by morning. Kushina said. Right. Said the others who were present. And with that they were back on their way to Dalmary town. Couple hours later, it was another couple hours before the group finally reached Dalmary town. Once they got there, the first thing they did was look for a doctor to check and make sure Meliodas' wound was fine. We now find Kurenai, Anko, Hana, Naruto, Kushina, Elizabeth and Hawk standing around in a doctor's office, with Diane outside by the window as the doctor checked Meliodas' shoulder. Well, I can tell you for sure that you did an excellent job of wrapping and disinfecting the wound, informed the doctor. Hana felt pride in herself at this bit. Now, it looks to be healing well. I would say another day or two of rest and some medicine, and it will be all healed. Wait here while I go get the medicine, informed the doctor before he got up and left. The group sighed in relief that nothing has gone wrong just yet. However, while everyone was waiting for the doctor to come back, none of them noticed an insect that seemed to stare at Diane from a rooftop. In a dark room, I found them. They're at the doctor's building, said a feminine voice. Are you going, Friesia? Asked another voice to the now named Friesia. Friesia was a woman who wore dark red armor with fur around the bottom half of her legs. Her helmet looked like an eight-legged spider, and in her hands was a green dual-tailed whip. The now named Friesia got up from where she was sitting. Yeah, I'll be going to deliver the first strike and end him along with that little group of his. She exclaimed while beginning to swing and twirl her whip. However, in her head, she was thinking, I hate this. I hate how the Holy Knights have changed from how they were before. Why did I join these jackasses anyways? Kurenai cleared her throat, gaining everyone's attention. Alright, well, now that we know he will be alright, we should make a plan. The group nodded and began to listen. Now, Diane, you will head to base dungeon to begin checking it out. Right. You can count on me. Diane exclaimed. Kurenai nodded then said, well, you do that, we'll go get the others, then follow soon after. Is this good with everyone? Everyone nodded yes, and with that Kurenai, Hana, Naruto and Kushina went to the boar hat to get the others. This left Anko, Diane, Elizabeth and Hawk alone while the doctor got the medicine. Well, began Diane while getting up, I better start heading to base dungeon. And with that, Diane began to make her way in the direction of base dungeon, but before she could get too far, Elizabeth came running out, with Hawk and Anko following her. Wait! Exclaimed Elizabeth, gaining Diane's attention. What's up? Asked Diane, curious on why Elizabeth stopped her. I wanted to know why you seem so excited about meeting Sir Ban. Asked Elizabeth. Diane began to blush before stuttering, what and new? Why would you think that? Because, as we came closer to base dungeon, you grew happier and more excited every day. Elizabeth explained, getting Diane to blush even more before she continued, I figured you were simply happy about being in a town and Meliodas getting checked, but you always seemed happiest whenever we would talk about Sir Ban. So, I wanted to know why you were excited about seeing Sir Ban again. Elizabeth concluded, with Diane beginning to look like a real giant tomato. Diane then sighed and put her head down, while still blushing before she looked back at Elizabeth and began, well, you see, I guess it started way back when I first met Ban. Flashback, many years ago. Diane was currently standing with her hands on her hips, looking quite annoyed. Why, you may ask. Well, it may have something to do with the 4 knights that are currently in front of her. Get out of here, yelled one of the knights. No one wants your kind here, yelled another knight. Diane then crossed her arms, humph. Why should I listen to you? It's not like you can do anything to force me. Diane said, while still looking annoyed. Besides, isn't it rude to try and force a beautiful girl to do something she doesn't want? What beautiful girl? You're just a giant. You're not beautiful. The knights yelled. Go back to your homeland. They yelled at her. Nobody could ever love monsters like you. They yelled again. I can't believe how arrogant you humans are. And all because there are so many of you. Diane said with a condescending look. Why you? We'll show you and force you to leave. Get her. Yelled one of the knights. Right. Yelled the others, and with that they began to charge at her. However, before they could make it halfway to her, the knights and Diane all heard a loud whoa. Before they then heard a crash, followed by a loud oomph sound. This made them all stop and turn to the sound, where they all saw a man who seemed to have fallen from a tree and was currently on the ground, rubbing his head before he stood up and yawned, showing his slightly enlarged canines. He had short silverish blue hair with red eyes that seemed to have a tinge of violet to them. He was wearing dark brown shoes, black, baggy pants with a black open vest with royal blue lining that showed his muscular physique. On top of it all, he was wearing a long black trench coat that seemed to fall down to his shins, and lying next to him on the floor was a dark purple drawstring bag with a light red bottom that was currently open, showing that inside were some clothes, wanted posters, some bottles of alcohol, a couple of spearhead-shaped throwing knives, and a steel 3-section staff. And I made the outfit up as something I could imagine Ban wearing with his hairstyle when he was known as Bandit Ban. The bag is the same one he takes with him when he leaves the others when they go searching for Eskener. The throwing knives are perfect point RC0406 throwing knives, and the staff is the one he used when he met Elaine. Diane and the knights watched as he then reached down, grabbed his bag, and put it over his shoulder, before he then looked at the 5 of them with a curious look, before he asked, "What's going on here? Move along. This has nothing to do with you," yelled the knights. "Just move along, human. I don't need your help," yelled Diane, thinking that this human is going to treat her badly as well. But she was surprised when, now why should leave a beautiful girl to fend for herself? He asked with a raised eyebrow. This surprised Diane as she had not expected him to compliment her like that and began to blush lightly. She was even more surprised when he began moving to stand between her and the knights. He stood there with his bag over his right shoulder, his left hand in his pants pocket, slouched and a lazy look in his eyes. "Hey assholes," he addressed the knights, which made the knights furious at how disrespectful he was being, and Diane giggled a bit, which the man caught and smiled lightly. "Why don't you guys just leave her alone? After all, it's not like she did anything to you. Why you? How dare you take the side of a monster? You bring shame to humans," yelled one of the knights. The man simply raised an eyebrow while pointing a finger at himself with his left hand. "I bring shame to humans. I think you must have me confused for yourself because only the worst kind of scum gang up on a beautiful girl," he said, making the other 5 present red in the face, for different reasons. The knights were red because they were furious at how disrespectful this man was being. Diane, however, was red because he called her beautiful again. "You traitor," yelled the knights, "we'll show you what happens when you side with monsters." "Guys, let's get him," yelled a knight. "Yeah." And with that, the 4 knights began to charge again, this time aiming for the disrespectful man standing in their way. The knights and Diane all saw that he hadn't moved or changed his stance at all and expected the man was going to be killed easy. What they didn't expect was that right when their swords were about to hit him, he disappeared from their sight. "You do know, you're not gonna be able to do much with those sticks in your hands, right?" asked a voice from the side. The knights and Diane turned and saw him leaning on the tree he had previously fallen out of, with all 4 knight swords. 3 were leaning against the tree with him, while he examined the 4th in his hands. The knights and Diane were all surprised to see this. The knights were confused on why those swords looked familiar before looking at their hands and saw that they were holding a bunch of sticks. That was when they realized he had stolen and replaced their swords with sticks in the blink of an eye. Diane was impressed that a human could move so fast. Now, he began, gaining everyone's attention on him again. "Do you still want to try and fight, or are you going to leave now?" the man asked, while now glaring at the knights with a dark aura around him, causing the knights to get scared and begin running away. Diane watched the knights run away before turning to the man as he relaxed while giving a sigh of relief before he sat down and continued examining the swords before asking himself, "I wonder how much these would sell for." "Hey." Diane began, gaining the man's attention. "I didn't need some puny human standing up for me. I could have taken care of myself," Diane exclaimed, feeling like the human thought she was a pushover. The man simply looked at her before going back to examining the swords and replying, "I know that, but that's not why I decided to stand up for you." Diane grew confused. "Then why did you decide to stand up for me?" she asked while crossing her arms underneath her bust, making them look bigger than they already are. "Because it was the right thing to do," replied the man while still looking at the swords, getting a surprised look from Diane, before he then added, "Besides, I just didn't like how those guys were ganging up on a beautiful girl such as yourself." Diane began blushing again, before shaking her head and glaring at him, which didn't look very menacing, considering she still had a blush. "Why are you lying?" she asked, getting the man to stop examining the swords before giving her a confused look. "What do you mean?" asked the man while tilting his head. "Come on, I know you can't possibly think I'm beautiful. You probably just said that to get on the knight's nerves, when in reality, you really think I'm a monster," explained Diane, thinking she had him. However, she was surprised when the man began chuckling before flat out laughing. "Why are you laughing?" Diane roared, wondering why he was laughing. The man continued to chuckle for a bit before he looked at her with a wide, happy smirk. "I'm laughing because you actually believe I would think you're a monster." This surprised Diane before the man said, "Why would I think a beautiful girl, such as yourself, is a monster?" Diane began blushing up a storm before she put her head down and began saying in a low voice, "Because I'm different from you. And what's wrong with that?" Diane raised her head in surprise, getting her to look at the man, who was currently wearing a soft smile, while still having a lazy look in his eyes. There's nothing wrong with being different, I have some friends who are different from those around them. All that matters is that you find people who accept you for who you are. Diane was surprised by this man, who instead of thinking and calling her a monster, instead called her beautiful and meant it. She began to blush again before she then cleared her throat and asked, "Well, can we maybe be friends?" The man nodded and said, "Sure, we can be friends." Before he then began chuckling again, this got Diane to blush a little more before she asked, "What? What are you laughing about?" The man stopped chuckling and looked at her before saying, "I'm laughing at how we became friends and yet we still don't know each other's names." The man began saying before he began laughing again at the end. Diane looked surprised before she joined in the laughing. "I guess you're right. So, let's introduce ourselves." Diane then kneeled down and held out her hand before saying, "My name is Diane and I'm from the Giant clan." The man looked at her hand for a second before he got up and moved towards her and gripped her hand as best he could, with her doing the same, being careful not to crush his hand. "Nice to meet you, Diane. My name is Ban Fox, of the human race." Flashback end. Diane had a beautiful, soft smile on her face before she continued, "From then on, we had been almost inseparable. We just moved where the wind took us, enjoying life, hanging out with villages that welcomed me in. And the villages that didn't, we would camp outside of the village and then leave in the morning." Diane then began laughing, "But every time we began to leave those villages, he would have me wait for a second before he ran back to the village for about 20 minutes every time before he came running back with this huge proud smile on his face, with the entire village chasing him." Diane started to laugh even harder when she remembered the villagers. All of them were either covered in paint, feathers, or had bad makeup and weird hairdos. Like orange afros, green spikes, or, my favorite, pink mohawks. This got Elizabeth and Hawk to start laughing, but Anko looked deep in thought. "Those pranks sound familiar, like I've seen them before," thought Anko, but the one I remembered doing them at the village. When Anko's thoughts began to trail off when she remembered the only person who ever did pranks like that in the village. Anko's eyes then went wide at that thought. "No. Is it possible?" Anko then began to think carefully on her assumption, but that doesn't make sense. Diane is describing her encounter from many years ago, but he was banished only 4 years ago. So, how would that work? As Anko was thinking, Diane, Elizabeth and Hawk just got done laughing, but she was brought out from her thoughts when Diane continued to talk. "We had a lot of fun, and we actually joined the 7 deadly sins together. But when we were framed for the Great Holy Knight's death, we all separated and I haven't seen him since." Diane frowned when she said this, before she then got a soft smile. "So if I seem excited, the reason is because this will be the first time in 10 years that I have seen my best friend again." Elizabeth, Anko, and Hawk all smiled at Diane, happy that she will be able to see her friend again for the first time in a long time. "Well," began Elizabeth, "good luck Lady Diane, and stay safe." Diane smiled and nodded before she got up to begin heading to base dungeon. But, before she could begin moving, all 4 of them noticed that the sky near base dungeon was getting dark and was moving towards the town. "Are they thunderclouds?" Hawk asked. "Is it Gilthunder again?" "No," Anko said, "it sounds like wings." Elizabeth then said, "This can't bugs." Hawk then exclaimed, "Not just any bugs. It's a massive swarm of poisonous bugs." The 3 women were shocked at this exclamation before they then watched as the swarm got closer. Then, when the bugs were right above the town, they all began spitting poisonous acid on the town, melting everything that was hit. This surprised the group as they watched the town being melted slowly. "This must be an attack from a holy knight," exclaimed Hawk. "Diane. We're counting on you to help. However, I hate bugs." Diane has a severe dislike for bugs. Elizabeth then noticed that the bugs were attacking the doctor's building too. So she began running to the doctor's building to try and warn Meliodas. Anko noticed she was running back and gave chase while forming some hand signs before she ended on Tiger and mentally shouted, "Kaiten. Nkakik no jutsu." But that led Anko lose a giant fireball into the sky, burning a good chunk of the insects. This caught Elizabeth's, Hawk's, and Diane's attention, and they were all amazed by this, with Diane having stars in her eyes again. But then Diane shook her head and got serious. "I can't let you show me up like that," Diane said, before she then slammed her hand on the ground. "Besides, we're stronger than the holy knights." She then raised her hand and from the ground came several pillars of earth that destroyed the rest of the bugs, so, letting a few bugs stop me would make me look bad. The trio were amazed to see how easily Diane destroyed the rest of the bugs. Before they began to check on everyone in the town. However, while the 4 were outside making sure everyone was safe and sound, Dr. Dana had come back with the medicine. "Here you go. This will help give you some comfort for the pain and it will make you feel sleepy, so make sure to go right to sleep right after. You still need rest after all," said Dr. Dana. Meliodas took the bowl and said with a smile, "Thank you very much for helping us." And with that Meliodas drank the medicine before laying down on the bed, going right to sleep. Dr. Dana then began to cry and sobbed, please, please forgive me. I don't have a choice. Meanwhile, in base dungeon, the two guards, who were currently standing outside of Ban's cell, began talking. Hey, wanna bet on who will win? Asked one of the guards. What do you mean? Asked the other. The weird fangs and the 7 deadly sins, they're fighting right now. Said the first guard. This got the attention of a certain prisoner with silver blue hair as he continued to listen in on the conversation. That's not much of fight. I heard that they currently only have their captain and one other member. Replied the second guard. This now really got the attention of the prisoner inside the cell, and just as he was about to kick down the door, he heard something even more interesting. True, but I also heard there is a group of women traveling with them, and one of them actually breathed fire just by making some weird hand gestures. The first guard said. This got the prisoner's eyes to widen before he finally decided to make his presence known. Well, that sounds really cool. Came a voice from inside the cell. This surprised the guards, who were immediately on alert when they heard the voice continue speaking. Sounds like it ought to be fun. Especially with that group of women who can breathe fire with just a few hand gestures. As soon as the voice was done talking, there was a loud bang. At the same time as a footprint was indented into the steel door. It then began to fall down until it hit the floor with another resounding bang. The guards were terrified as they saw a silhouette of a man begin walking out of the cell. Out of the cell came a man with long, messy, silverish blue hair that reached his upper back with thick facial hair to match and red eyes that had a touch of violet. He had unbuttoned purple pants with metal studs and holes that revealed where the metal spikes had previously been. He still had 2 more spikes in his body, with one in his left shin and the other in his right forearm. But the thing that really drew attention was the red fox symbol on the left side of his abdominals. Ah. The man groaned while cracking his neck, it feels so good to walk around every now and then. And no way. The 7 deadly sins, Ban. The fox sin. Exclaimed the first guard. The second guard then exclaimed, damn you. How did you get out of there and why now? The now named Ban said, isn't it obvious? He then reached down for the spike in his shin and pulled it out with a little effort that was heard in his voice when he said, I kicked the door down. He then tossed the spike on the ground before reaching for the spike in his arm and began to pull on it while saying, and as for why, it's because you were talking about some totally interesting stuff. And then pulled the spike out and caused some blood to splash on his face while saying, you said he was alive. Our captain. He then looked at the 2 guards with a serious look and narrowed eyes, and what was that about women breathing fire? The 2 guards were terrified as they watched him toss the last spike to the ground. However, before they could answer, a voice came from a couple feet away and was getting closer. What's all this commotion? The owner of the voice was young knight with silverish lavender hair that was held in a ponytail, with some hair swept over the left side of their face and amber eyes. They wore a dark purple coat over regular, steel, full-body armor, with a sword at their side that has a U-shaped pommel, and the guard is made of 2 straight pieces with curves at the end, with one facing the sword and the other facing the pommel. Gay Jericho? Exclaimed one of the guards in relief. The now named Jericho then began said, ban of the 7 deadly sins. I don't know you escaped, but return there at once. Well, pointing their thumb in the direction of Ban's cell at the last part. How about some respect, little girl? Ban began, before continuing while stroking his beard, I'm not sure how you were raised, but is that any way to talk to a hero? Jericho just replied by saying, I am an apprentice holy knight. You dare call me little girl? That's pretty disrespectful for a prisoner on death's door. Jericho then turned to the guards and ordered, go to Sir Gulgius and the others at once. Tell them all, Jericho had to defeat the fox in when he escaped and tried to resist. Right. Came the reply from the guards before they began leaving. After about a minute, it was now just Ban and Jericho, and they stood in silence for a moment before Jericho began to reach for her sword, then she began running at him before she began to swing her sword at a fast pace. To a normal person, it would look like there were multiple Jerichos attacking Ban. Ah! Screamed Ban, while Jericho then appeared behind Ban before flicking and sheathing her sword while not facing Ban, believing she had just defeated him. But then instead of hearing the sound of a bleeding body falling to the ground, "Ah-ew, ha-ho-ho. Do you think I had you take off too much?" asked Ban as he turned around, rubbing his chin while also showing his new haircut with a satisfied smirk on his face. Jericho turned around in shock, with wide eyes as she watched Ban rub his chin. Well, it feels pretty good, so I guess I'm okay with it. You got some real talent with that sword there, little lady. Keep practicing and you might be able to beat me one day. Ban said, while complimenting her, causing her to blush lightly from the compliment. Jericho then shook her head and asked, how did you dodge my sword with all those injuries? Sounding slightly shaken up. Ban looked kinda surprised before he replied, injuries? What are you talking about? Huh? before he began waving his arms up and down, along with his legs, while examining himself, showing that his body had no injuries on it. Jericho then looked really shaken up before saying, "That's impossible. Your limbs were full of holes from steel spikes running through them. It'd be good if you remembered this, little lady," began Ban, gaining Jericho's attention. "There's only one wound on me, and it's this one right here, got it?" He continued, while now pointing at the scar that was on his neck and led up to his cheek. Jericho was surprised by this, but she didn't have a chance to reply, as Ban then said, "So you could say that injuries I get from that guy are kinda a special case, I guess." Jericho was surprised by this information, but before she could come up with something to say, Ban then added one more thing. Now, Ban began with his head slightly down to shadow his eyes, before he then raised it and looked at Jericho with the same look that he gave the guards from before and said, "Maybe you can tell me about these women who breathe fire." The look he had on put Jericho slightly on edge, and yet, at the same time, it slightly turned her on from seeing how powerful and handsome he looked. Sometimes she really hated how much her teacher rubbed off on her. Meanwhile, back at Dr. Dana's office, Anko, Elizabeth, and Hawk were back inside Dr. Dana's office, where they found Meliodas on the bed sleeping. Elizabeth was sitting next to the bed watching Meliodas to make sure he was alright. Hawk was resting on a stool nearby, and Anko was leaning against the wall, next to the door. As they were watching Meliodas, Dr. Dana came into the room and asked, "How is the patient doing?" Elizabeth answered, "He been doing well. That medicine you gave him seems to have put him to sleep." Hawk agreed and said, "Yeah, he looks dead or something." Elizabeth got scared by this before she turned to Hawk and exclaimed, "Hawk, don't say that." Anko then finally decided to ask something that had been on her mind since the three of them came into the room with Meliodas. "Hey Drive. Dana, I know you're a man of medicine and all, but something has been bothering me about that medicine," she asked while pointing to the bowl that had held the medicine before Meliodas drank it. Dr. Dana turned to Anko and asked, "Yes, what is it?" Anko then moved to the doctor and had an angry look on her face before she picked up the doctor by his collar, surprising Hawk and Elizabeth. "If it was supposed to be medicine," Anko began, getting Dr. Dana to begin to lightly sweat at what he figured she was about to ask, "then why does it smell so much like poison?" Elizabeth and Hawk were now really surprised at what Anko was accusing the doctor of, but before they could say anything, Dr. Dana said, "Because it is." It caused Elizabeth and Hawk to go wide-eyed, with Anko getting angrier, but the doctor continued, "Wolfsbane, belladonna, tiger beetle, henbane leaf make a deadly poison when mixed. Once taken, you begin to feel sleepy before you decide to go to sleep, where you then never wake your eyes again. No pain, no suffering." Anko was now livid at what the person who was supposed to help decided to go against their oath and instead kill one of the people who they were supposed to help that could have helped them stop the Holy Knights. Elizabeth was distraught at finding out that Meliodas was dead, as was Hawk. However, before any of them could say anything, they all heard a voice. "Do please forgive the good doctor, he was after all only doing what he was told in exchange for his daughter." Anko dropped Dana and moved to Elizabeth and Hawk before pulling out two kunai that she held in a reverse grip in both hands. Then, out of nowhere, a knight appeared in the room, standing between the group and Dr. Dana. He wore full body armor, with his torso covered in a metal breastplate, while his arms were covered in metal chainmail. The upper part of his legs were covered in armor as well, but the rest were clad in knee-length metal boots. His helmet, however, was what really brought attention. It looked like a demon with slanted eyes, 9 dots were over each eye, a mouth of shark teeth, and horns on the side. Behind him looked to be a sword with the blade appearing to be a foot in width and a foot and a half in length. The group were surprised at this holy knight just appearing out of nowhere, who had his right arm placed in front of him, as if he were going to bow, and said, "Allow me to introduce myself, I am Holy Knight Golgius of the Weird Fangs." He then bowed slightly and put his right arm forward towards Elizabeth. "Princess Elizabeth, I have come to pick you up." Hawk then got in front of Elizabeth and exclaimed, "Not so fast. I, Sir Hawk, Knight of Scrap's Disposal, shall be your opponent." However, Sir Golgius didn't bother with Hawk and simply said, "And, the sword," he exclaimed while lifting the blanket from Meliodas' body to show Meliodas still held onto the sword. Golgius then turned to Meliodas and said, "7 sins Meliodas, this is worthless while in your hands, so we will be taking it back." Sir Golgius then began to reach for the sword, but when grabbed the sword and held it up to examine it, he noticed Meliodas was still holding onto it, standing with shadowed eyes. Everyone was shocked to see that Meliodas was standing, even though they had been informed that he had taken a powerful poison. While they were all trying to figure out how this happened, Meliodas was remembering a night from the past. Flashback, many years ago. It was the middle of the night. Diane, Ban, and Meliodas were all camping out in a canyon. Lying next to them were the dead bodies of some monsters that they had killed. Currently, Diane was sleeping on the ground off to the side, and Ban and Meliodas were sitting by the fire. They had just finished eating when Ban decided to say something that had been on his mind for a while. "Hey, Captain. Meliodas was drinking some alcohol and said, "Yeah, what is it? How come you always have that sword with you?" Ban asked, "I mean, I've never seen you without it, what's so special about it anyways?" "It's not that special," replied Meliodas. "So can I see it?" Ban asked. "Sorry Ban, but you can't," replied Meliodas. Ban moved over to behind Meliodas and grabbed the hilt of the sword. "Come on, just let me have a little peek." Ban was then surprised when Meliodas grabbed the hilt as well and said, "Let go, Ban." It was at this time that Diane began to wake up and while rubbing her eyes, she said, "Hey you two, you're still up. Just step away Ban, you don't want to make me angry." Meliodas said. Ban blinked his eyes before he asked, "Make you angry, are you serious? You and me have been hanging together for a lot of years now. And in all that time, I've never seen you get mad once." "I mean it," said Meliodas, with his eyes now covered by his hair. Diane is still off on the side, watching with a worried expression when she heard Ban say how he was wondering how Meliodas got called the dragon sin of wrath. She decided to find out what was going on and asked, "Ban, what do you think you're doing?" Ban then began to really try and take the sword by pulling with both hands, and while doing this, he was saying, "If doing this means I get to see you angry, then I want to see it even more." Ban then got a greedy glint in his eyes and said, "No, I want to steal it." It was then that Meliodas swung the sword and sliced Ban along the left side of his neck and on part of his cheek from his chin. Diane then exclaimed, "Ban." Worried for her best friend, who just got sliced. Ban then jumped back and landed on his feet while chuckling before he said, "Well, looks like I just saw a hit inside of you. Cool." While rubbing some of the blood away from the wound, Meliodas then began to say, "Sorry about that, Ban. But this sword is." Flashback end. Suddenly, an immense amount of pressure began to fill the room before Meliodas said, "I can never let go of the sword, even if I die. This is the only thing I can do to atone for my sin." Meliodas then looked at Golgius and showed that he had black eyes as well as a black spiral mark above his right eye. Golgius began to shake in fear, however before he could escape, he was captured by several purple chains that had energy coming off of them. This snapped Meliodas out of it as everyone looked to see that it was Kushina with chains coming out of her back, holding Golgius in place, with an angry look on her face as well with the rest of the Kunoichi standing all around the room. "I don't like it when someone sneaks up on me, however, I hate it when someone sneaks up on people I care about," Kushina said before she then slowly began tightening the chains around Golgius. Everyone could hear the sound of creaking metal, meaning that Kushina was slowing crushing Golgius. Golgius was shouting in pain, "Please spare me." "Hold on, Kushina-sensei," spoke Anko, gaining everyone's attention. "We can't kill him because he said they are holding the doctor's daughter hostage. So, how about you give him to me so I can find out where exactly?" All the Kunoichi agreed and Elizabeth, Meliodas and Hawk could see a certain glint in Anko's eyes that made them shiver. However, Golgius decided to be really stupid and exclaimed, "Ha! You'll never get anything out of me, you stupid bitch." At this, the room went silent before everyone felt and saw a dark aura around Anko as she stood with shadowed eyes before she looked at Golgius and they all saw in her eyes, said the word dark before Anko then said, "Well, I guess you really need to be taught a lesson." Anko then grabbed Golgius by one of the horns on his helmet before saying, "Come along now, it's time that Mistress Anko gives you a lesson." With that, they all watched Anko disappear into another room with Golgius before they began to hear cries of pain and shouts begging for mercy. This continued for 5 minutes where Anko then walked out looking very pleased with herself before she then told everyone, "Well, it as turns out, the doctor's daughter was also being held at base dungeon. So, this actually works for us because as we look for Ban, we can also look for the man's daughter while we're at it. This kills 2 birds with 1 stone." The group agreed with this, but then Meliodas decided to add, "Actually, we'll only need to focus on finding Sinet." Everyone was confused by this and Satsuki asked, "Why? I thought we were also supposed to get banned from base dungeon as well." Everyone was nodding at this before Meliodas elaborated, "Well, you see, we only need to focus on finding the doctor's daughter because if I know Ban, he'll have heard that we're here and will have busted himself out already and is simply waiting for us." Everyone now had a look of understanding at what Meliodas was saying and decided to trust his word. And with that, all the Kunoichi, Elizabeth, Meliodas and Hawk all began to make their way out of the town towards base dungeon. As they were walking, Elizabeth suddenly remembered something. "Oh," she exclaimed getting everyone's attention before she pulled out Meliodas' bag and sheath for his sword. "While you were sleeping, I fixed your things for you. It might not be very good but." "Oh, thanks Elizabeth," said Meliodas as he put his stuff back on. And with that, the group continued towards base dungeon. However, as they were on their way, Diane suddenly appeared in front of them, which startled Elizabeth, Hawk and Hinata at her sudden appearance. "Diane?" asked Meliodas, "What are you doing here?" Diane was staring at them with blank eyes. "Captain." She wondered for a second before her eyes widened and she started exclaiming, "Captain, you're supposed to be resting. What are you doing here?" "He's fine, but the important question is, what are you doing here?" Kushina asked, curious on why Diane was here. "What do you mean what am I doing here?" asked Diane, genuinely curious. Anko then stepped and said, "Well, after you helped me finish the rest of the bugs attacking the town, you began to follow the plan and were headed to base dungeon so that you could check it out while you wait for us to meet you there." Diane was silent before she tilted her head and asked, "I did?" At this, the group began to suspect that something was off, that was at least, until they all suddenly heard a bell ring and then Diane began to shout, "A holy night," while looking right at Meliodas. They watched Diane looked around asking where Meliodas was until she suddenly attacked Meliodas while shouting, "Give them back." Diane's attack launched Meliodas a good several meters back before he crashed and stopped moving. The group was shocked by this, then they saw Diane grip her fist and say, "Let me say this to your face, I won't lose to some holy knight." Everyone then began running as Diane began to chase them, and as they were running, they noticed a man and a child walking. They all grabbed the two before they hid in a ditch. They all peeked over the edge to see that Diane had stopped and was now looking for them. Kurenai then noticed that Diane's eyes were clouded over and she then understood what was happening, she's in an illusion. Everyone looked at Kurenai in shock before she explained, "Her eyes are clouded over so she wasn't able to see us." Diane must have been seen and got caught in the illusion that makes her see Meliodas as the holy knight that casted the illusion. Everyone then had wide eyes at realizing this, but then Kurenai continued, "And earlier, she was fine and talking to us, but then a bell ringing was heard and she then began attacking us, so it had to be caused by a bell." Kurenai was still explaining, but then she trailed off as she stared at something with narrowed eyes, and everyone began to look at where she was staring, where they saw the boy and the man. They all then noticed the boy's staff had a little bell on it, this caused everyone to be on alert. "Who are you?" shouted Kurenai, "You are clearly behind this turn of events, so who are you?" The boy began chuckling before he was replaced with a holy knight. This one was wearing deep blue armor with a long black skirt. He was wearing a helmet that looked like a human face and had 22 holes on both sides, and in his hand was a larger version of the staff the boy was previously holding. "Well, you seem to have caught on rather quickly. My name is Ruin of the Weird Fangs and I will be the one to bring ruin to the 7 deadly sins." At the same time, the group then heard buzzing and looked up to see more insects coming their way. They then also heard a loud boom and turned to also see Meliodas and Diane fighting when they noticed that Meliodas now had clouded eyes as well. The group decided to then split up. Anko, Hinata, and Satsuki would deal with the bugs, Kurenai, Naruto, and Hana would try and break Diane and Meliodas out of the illusions, and finally Kushina and Tenten would deal with Ruin. The group then separated and headed off to do their tasks, and they all thought the same thing. "Damn, this is going to suck." Back in base dungeon. While this was all going on, there was a bit of excitement also happening back at base dungeon. "Find the 7 sins ban. The fox sin of greed," shouted Jericho. Right away, but Lady Jericho began one of the many knights that were currently in the hall. "Why are you dressed like that?" finished another knight. "You see, right now, Jericho is sitting on the floor in nothing but her pink frilly bra and panties, with only her coat to cover herself, even though it was slightly shortened." Jericho was blushing brightly and said, "Never mind that. Now, go get me a change of clothes and my suit of armor." The knights were just staring and leering at her with lust, making Jericho feel very uncomfortable before she shouted, "What are you waiting for? I said go." But that the group of knights began running to get what Jericho needed, with one standing in place staring at her for a little longer before another knight came back and grabbed him, taking him away before they were all gone. "I can't believe he was right," she said, while remembering what Ban had told her before she had been found. Flashback, a couple minutes ago, Ban was currently holding Jericho up by her cheeks with his hand underneath her chin. She dropped her sword as she was having a hard time breathing and said, "Just finish me." But she was surprised when Ban instead simply lowered her so she could breathe easily again, which caused her to begin coughing before he said, "You know, despite whatever stories were told about me and the others, we're not actually the bad guys. It's the holy knights that you serve that are the bad guys." Jericho was surprised by this and exclaimed, "That's a lie. The holy knights are the good guys. They're ones who are trying to protect this country." "Yes, but from whom and at what cost?" This question threw Jericho for a loop as she began to think about it, but she wasn't allowed to think for long before Ban continued, "You see, if the holy knights are supposed to be these good guys that you believe, then why are they causing problems for people? Why are they threatening people for supplies instead of simply requesting them? Why are they raping innocent women? And also, if they were such good guys, then why are they the ones who are causing so many issues? And all of this was done in the name of the holy knights." Jericho began to really think about this because she didn't want to believe that the holy knights were really that bad, but as she thought about it more, she began to realize that he was right. She had tried to ignore it, but she remembered her teacher, Vermilion Sensei, also saying how the Holy Knights had a dark secret. She remembered her teacher telling her how, if it wasn't the only way to keep them from corrupting her, who was such an honest and righteous soul, she would never have joined the Holy Knights. If what you say is true, then why have I not seen it for myself? Asked Jericho. Anne answered by saying, that is because you are never in the right place at the right time and never look in the right direction. But, I will help by putting you in the right position so that you can see exactly what I mean. Just don't hate me for what I will have to do. And with that, Ban's voice began to echo and fade. Flashback end. Jericho, still with her blush and clutching the coat to her body, said, I still don't like how I had to go through with this. She then began to blush even darker when she remembered what he told her after taking her armor and clothes, but at least he told me I have nothing to be ashamed about. But Ban, after discarding Jericho's clothes and armor because of them not fitting, is now walking through based, looking around a couple of cells when he sees a short, fat and ugly knight crouching in front of a cell, looking inside with a look of lust. Ban, curious as to what the man is looking at, walks over and asks, what you looking at? The knight then responded by saying, her. Isn't she a fine woman? Ban then looked inside the cell and saw a woman currently chained to the wall. She has shoulder-length lightish brown hair, soft brown eyes, and was wearing a pair of glasses. She was also wearing a white blouse that hugged her D-cup breasts, with a dark blue long-sleeved shirt over that. She was also wearing a long white skirt with a belt and sandals. She looked very beautiful, but currently, she looked very cute as she looked back at them with an embarrassed blush on her cheeks. The knight then explained how Golgius had kidnapped her and that her name was Sinette and that she was the daughter of a doctor in Dalmary. I just can't get enough of her. It's alright if we take her, right? I mean, no one is looking. Ban then said, I like her. This got the knight to look at him. Hey, I was here first, who are you? Ban simply smiled at the man before he slammed the guy's head into the bars, knocking him out and slightly scaring Sinette. She then watched as Ban gave her a lazy smile while raising his hand to show her he meant no harm. He then reached for the bars and then bent all of them to the side before entering the cell. Sinette was shaking as she watched a man advance towards her, fearing that he would do something to her. Ban then crouched in front of her and lightly cupped her chin with his right hand before he began moving it towards her shirt while saying, I'll be. His hand then went in between her dark blue shirt and blouse. This caused Sinette to shut her eyes and fear for the worse before he then pulled out a dagger while he finished saying, borrowing your dagger. Sinette saw this and said, my father gave me that to protect myself. Ban looked at the dagger before he went on to describe the dagger before he then waved his arm to the side, slicing the chains off of Sinette and the wall and finished by saying that the sharpness wasn't bad. Ban then crouched back down in front of Sinette and said with a soft smile, your father must love you very much to give an excellent blade like this. Sinette began to blush at Ban's smile before she then accepted the dagger back and said, thank you for giving this back. Well, it given to me to protect myself, it was also my mother's memento. Ban smiled at her before he stood up and offered her a hand, which she gratefully took and stood up with his help. As the two were beginning to exit the cell, they heard a voice address Ban. Where do you think you're going, Ban of the 7 deadly sins? Ban and Sinette turned and saw another holy knight standing in the hall, looking in their direction. This one was wearing dark-colored armor with spikes all over his armor. He was carrying a shield that had spikes all around the perimeter, with a rose insignia on it. His helmet looked like a bunch of purple metal vines that covered his face, only leaving one red eye visible. He then added, you are going to die right here and now. Ban simply smirked and said, why, oh holy knight Jude. Behind him, Sinette looked at Ban and was thinking, this man is one of the 7 deadly sins. You're going to kill me? Why do it now? Asked Ban. We have no more use for you. You were simply bait for the sins captain and you've fulfilled that role. Explained Jude before he continued, my fellow knights should be finishing up with your 2 fellow sins right about now. And once I've killed you, there will be 4 less criminals in the world. Ban simply began chuckling before he said, I hope your dream comes true. Jude then asked, 5 years ago, who was it that caught and tortured you, or have you forgotten? Ban simply stared at Jude with a stoic look while saying nothing. Back with the others, the group was having a tough time against the Holy Knights, considering there were 2, and almost half of their group was trying to break the illusions on Meliodas and Diane. They wouldn't have as much of an issue fighting the 2 if it wasn't for the fact that one of them can fight with bugs almost exactly like an Abiram, while the other can cast illusions like no tomorrow. All in all, it was not easy. Right now, Anko, Hinata and Satsuki were trying to stop the bug using Holy Knight. Anko and Satsuki were using multiple Gakakik no jutsus to burn all the bugs, while Hinata was using her clan's Haki KKSHM in order to send blasts of air, annihilating large groups of bugs as well. It was an incredibly slow process and they needed a lucky break or else they would run out of chakra. As that was going on, Kushina and Tenten were fighting against Ruin, who kept casting illusions at them, which they had to stop and then focus on breaking out of them. But every time they did this, they gave Ruin the chance to attack them, which he always took. It was now beginning to get on their nerves on how he fought, because they thought he would be physically weak since he used illusions, but that turned out to be very wrong when he would launch an attack that would send them skidding back several feet. They had to be on their toes the entire time, but it wasn't easy since they would never know when he would cast an illusion until it was too late. This led to them being covered in bruises and scratches from Ruin's attacks and skidding on the ground. Meanwhile, Hana and Naruto were all trying to stop Diane and Meliodas from moving around so much in order for Kurenai to break them of the illusions they were currently under. Naruto was trying to use her chains to tie up the two sins, but they were so strong and quick that it was very difficult for Naruto to get a proper hold on one of them. "Come on, damn it," exclaimed Naruto, "just sit still long enough for us to help." Naruto was trying again to stop Diane so that Kurenai could break them out of it. Hana was using some Doton jutsus to try and slow them down. They kept trying and trying until finally they caught a lucky break when Hana managed to turn the ground into thick mud that made it hard for Diane and Meliodas to move, which gave Naruto the opportunity to wrap her chains around Diane's torso and legs, along with Meliodas as well, but they were beginning to struggle, which made it difficult for Naruto to keep her hold on them. "Kurenai. Do it, now. Well, I still have a hold on them," exclaimed Naruto, who was sweating and panting very hard because of how much focus and energy it was taking her to hold the two sins in place. Kurenai nodded her head and rushed between Meliodas and Diane before she put her hands in the ram seal and then shouted, "Kai." While sending out a burst of chakra that made them both stop struggling before they both then shook their heads and looked very confused. Why are we being held in chains?" asked Diane, who was greatly confused on what happened along with Meliodas. "You were both caught in an illusion that made you think the other was a holy knight in order to attack each other in an attempt to destroy the other," explained Naruto as she began to release Diane and Meliodas from her chains. The two were surprised at this before they got angry expressions on their faces and turned to see the two holy knights that were still there. Meliodas and Diane glanced at each other before they nodded and took off for their respective targets, with Meliodas heading towards Ruin and Diane heading towards Frisia. When Meliodas got to Ruin, he grabbed his arm tightly, bending the metal to his grip while saying, "You are a terrible knight." This surprised Ruin as he exclaimed, the spell was broken. Meliodas then punched Ruin in the stomach with so much force, he broke the ground and launched Ruin into the wall of base dungeon. This surprised all of the knights who were outside around base dungeon as lookouts. Meliodas was moving towards Ruin who tried to attack him, but Meliodas had dodged all of the attacks before he then slammed his fist into Ruin's torso, shattering the man's armor. "You managed to break my armor, impressive," said Ruin. "Did you think I would say something like that?" exclaimed Ruin before he showed his 8-pack abs. "This armor is nothing more than shallow skin. My true armor is this body, which is harder and stronger than steel." Ruin then looked forward and exclaimed, "Well, what are you going to do now?" However, he wasn't expecting Meliodas to bury his fist so far into his body that it threatened to come out of his back. Ruin began coughing up blood before he was launched towards the wall of base again. Meliodas then said, "You tried to turn me and my friend against each other. That is your sin." Back inside based, with Ban. Back inside, we find Sinet back inside her cell, peeking past a corner with a worried look. She was watching as Jude had put a spike through the center of Ban's chest. Ban had blood coming from his mouth, the hole in his chest, and was against the wall being held there by Jude, who's holding the spike. Jude was in Ban's face when he began by asking, "Is it painful?" Jude then moved to be in Ban's face when he continued, "Didn't I already say it? You already filled your role, Fox's sin Ban. But you know why I was captured by you 5 years ago?" asked Ban. Jude just scoffed and said, "You make it sound like you got captured by me on purpose. Back then, I wanted pain," Ban said, surprising both Jude and Sinet, who was still watching, before Ban continued, "I wanted the feeling of pain in order to be punished for my past. But I think I've been punished enough." Ban ended with a bloody smile as he grabbed the spike and began to pull it out. Ban looked over to Sinet and said, "I don't want you to think badly of me, so could you please turn around or go back into the cell? I will call you out when I am done." Sinet nodded slowly before she went back inside the cell, where she then heard the sound of metal and flesh being pierced, which caused her to flinch. "You see, I thought I had failed my group and that they all died. That is why I wanted to feel pain, but you just told me the captain is alive. That means that I no longer need to blame myself, so I no longer need to be punished," Ban said. As it turned out, that Ban had returned the favor and stabbed Jude in the center of his chest straight through his armor. Jude began to talk in a shaky voice that was slowly growing weaker. Why you're plotting the same thing from 10 years ago, aren't you? T to overthrow TT the kingdom W well, just K know that every single HH holy knight in the KK kingdom will declare war on the 7 deadly sins. Diane just looked at Jude before saying, you seem to messed in the head because we never tried to overthrow the kingdom. And with that, Jude died before his body began sliding to the ground. Diane sighed before he moved to the cell where Sinette was still inside and said, hey, sorry you had to hear all of that. I hope I didn't scare you. Sinette looked at Ban with slightly fearful eyes before she saw his slightly sheepish expression with his still lazy eyes. Sinette began to calm down before she shook her head no, showing she wasn't scared of Ban. Ban gave a small smirk before he offered his hand to her, which she gratefully took before they began moving to try and find an exit. Outside base dungeon, the knights were now very fearful at Ruin being defeated. They then heard another crash and turned to see that it was Frisia who had crashed into the ground without most of her armor, with the only pieces left being her left boot and her right gauntlet. Frisia can now be seen as quite the beautiful woman, despite the multiple bruises, scratches and cuts. She had a curvy figure as seen by her double D cup breasts that were hugged inside of her sleeveless pinkish red leotard which showed a great amount of cleavage and had a diamond cutout that revealed her smooth stomach. She also had black arm and leg warmers. She had light brown hair and soft brown eyes that currently showed she was in a great amount of pain. This caused the knights to begin running away and not looking back. She muttered, damn, I knew these 3 were dumbasses. I hate how the holy knights are now. So, why did I join these guys? She thought no one heard her, but Diane, who had been moving towards her to knock her out, did and was surprised by this. She had never expected there to be holy knights who don't like being holy knights. She then moved over and gently lifted Frisia up to her face before asking in a quiet tone so that only the 2 of them knew what was being said. Are you really not like the holy knights? Frisia looked up at Diane with eyes that were as widened as possible, considering all the pain she was in, before she replied, no, I originally joined because I thought the holy knights were actually good, but then I watched and experienced how they actually aren't. I watched knights steal from the people we were supposed to help, kill the people, cause problems, and rape people. I experienced their evilness because they took advantage of the fact that I'm a woman and made it almost impossible to get where I am. They made it where anything I did was taken by someone else and they received the credit. They made it where I had to give my body to higher ranked knights just to get the credit of any missions I did and I hated it. Frisia at this point had begun to cry from remembering the suffering and hardship she went through and saw while a part of the holy knights. Diane was appalled at all of the suffering Frisia went through, especially since they did this to their own knights. Diane was also angered by how someone wasn't recognized for their achievements and could only gain the recognition by giving up her body. Finally, Diane was disgusted by how low the holy knights have fallen by actually demanding that one of their female knights give up her body just to be able to reach a higher position. Diane thought for a second before she asked, well, if you hate the holy knights so much, why do you stay with them? Frisia then looked up at Diane with wide eyes that had tears in them before she began to think about it. Why did she stay with the holy knights? They did nothing good for her or the people. She had joined them because she thought they were the good guys, but were they? No. They were not. They were terrible people who had caused the suffering of the people. They were the ones who killed innocent people with no remorse. And they were the ones who took her virginity that she had been saving for when she finds someone to love. I don't know anymore, but I don't want to stay. That is for sure. Said Frisia. Diane then softly smiled and asked, how would you like to come with us then? Frisia was surprised by this sudden offer before she began to smile softly while closing her eyes and replied, yeah, I would like to come along. Diane nodded before she slowly and gently took off her bag before she opened it and began to softly place Frisia inside. Before Diane closed it however, Frisia said, thank you for helping me. I would like to return the favor now by telling you we're the doctor's daughter and the Sinar. Diane looked surprised before she nodded her head and said, thank you, and don't worry. Once we get back to town, we'll make sure you're taken care of until you're all better. Frisia smiled and said, thank you, and you are looking for the round building of the dungeon on the right side. That is where the 2 of them are. Diane smiled and said, thank you for that information. Now get some rest, you're still really hurt. Frisia nodded her head before she closed her eyes and began to sleep. Diane closed her bag, then she slowly and carefully put it back on before she walked over and met the Kunoichi, Elizabeth, Hawk, and Meliodas. Meliodas then asked, so, did you find out where they are? He then looked back to where she came from and asked, and what happened to the holy knight you were fighting? Yeah, the holy knight told me they're over there in the round building on the right-hand side. Diane said, while pointing to the building she was told. As for where she is, began Diane before she pointed to her bag, she surprised me. It turned out, she didn't like the holy knights anymore and she wanted to leave, so I put her inside of my bag, where she is sleeping right now. I promised her that after we get Ban and the doctor's daughter, she would receive medical attention. Everyone was surprised to hear that a holy knight didn't like being a holy knight anymore and instead wanted to go with them. Then the Kunoichi and Elizabeth smiled at how kind Diane was for accepting and helping an enemy who no longer wished to be an enemy. "Well," began Meliodas, "let's head on inside." The group then began to move towards the entrance before they all went inside. Once they went inside, the entrance was sealed before there was an exclamation of, "The entry has been sealed," with the Sins and their accomplices inside. Jericho, who was now in some clothes and new armor, turned and asked, "What are your order, Sir Golgius?" "We find a heavily damaged Golgius, with breaks, dents, and cracks all over his armor, standing as best he can," before he said, "I'm impressed, 7 deadly sins. To deal such a blow to the weird fangs and turn one of us against the rest." Golgius then held a small black orb between his fingers that had a symbol on it before he continued, "However, that strength has instead invited your agonizing death." Jericho looked at Golgius in shock for what he held in his hand. "That's an incantation orb," she exclaimed before she began thinking, "If he activates that, then they won't be able to come back out ever. That means I won't be able to see Ban again to thank him." As Jericho realized that she won't be able to see Ban again, Golgius answered, "Correct. It's an incantation to trigger the trap." Golgius then threw the orb down to the ground, causing a thick purple smoke to appear before it grew and slowly began to cover the entirety of base dungeon. This is the counter trap for the 7 deadly sins, the Eternal Seal spell. It is a seal so powerful that they wouldn't be able to break it even with 10 tyrant dragons. Ha 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 ha. Golgius then began laughing like a madman, thinking that the 7 deadly sins won't be able to escape. Meanwhile, Jericho was feeling distraught at that because she had wanted to meet Ban again in the future after she received more training from her teacher. Please. Please, let them find a way out. Jericho mentally prayed so that the other knights around her won't be able to hear her. Inside base dungeon, the group were walking through base looking for where Ban and Sinette might be when they came up to a part that was only human-sized. "It's too narrow for me to keep going," complained Diane. However, from the door came Sinette, who was surprised to see all of them. "Oh. Hello, my name is Sinette and I'm the daughter of a doctor in Dalmarie town. You wouldn't happen to know a way out of here for me and my friend, would you?" Sinette asked after introducing herself. Everyone was surprised to have found the doctor's daughter so easily, which was voiced by Diane. "Wait, if you're Dr. Dana's daughter, then who?" Diane's voice began to trail as they heard footsteps coming from the door before they all saw Ban come out of the door and standing next to Sinette with his hands in his pockets and slightly slouched. When everyone saw him, they all had different reactions. Diane began to smile brightly at seeing her friend, Elizabeth, Hinata, and Kurenai began to blush at his muscular, shirtless elf. Anko, Tenten, Hana, and Satsuki began to stare at his body lustfully, but it was Kushina and Naruko looked on with smiles at seeing that they found Ban. "Naruko!" exclaimed Kurami from inside Naruko's head, getting her to jump slightly, which was noticed by Kushina. "What? What is it? Is something wrong?" Naruko asked Kurami in her mind, fearing that something happened. "That's him. That's Naruto," exclaimed Kurami, causing Naruko to go wide-eyed, which made Kushina curious and slightly worried for Naruko. "Naruko, what's wrong?" asked Kushina. However, before Naruko could answer, they heard Meliodas talk. "Ban?" asked Meliodas. "Hey, Captain," replied Ban. Now, it was silent as the two stared at each other with tense looks. The atmosphere also felt tense as everyone could feel the tension. They both seem upset. "What's going on? I've got a bad feeling about this," said Hawk, slightly scared. Diane then sat on the ground and said, "You're right. I think all of you may want to get behind me and hide there." This scared Hawk even more and he let out a whimper. Sinette also moved over the group as well. Meliodas and Ban continued to stare at each other before they then narrowed their eyes a bit. Then, "Diane!" exclaimed a happy Meliodas as he raised his arms high in the air. "Captain!" exclaimed a happy Ban, who had put his hands up. The two began running towards each other, laughing, before they began to slap each other's hands multiple times. The Kunoichi sweat dropped at the sight of two of Britannia's worst criminals acting like children, while Sinette, Diane, and Elizabeth giggled at their actions. Hawk asked, "What's that? A game of patty cake gone horribly wrong?" They then watched as Ban raised both his arms up with a smile and exclaimed, "Captain," before he slammed both arms into Meliodas, sending him flying through multiple walls before he finally came to a stop. Everyone went wide-eyed at this, as they had never expected Meliodas to just get sent flying through walls. "Ha ha ha ha. My turn. Me next. Ha 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 ha." Ban exclaimed, laughing while jumping up and down and waving his arms. Meliodas then came flying into Ban and head-butted Ban and sent him flying through multiple walls as well. The whole hall was shaking from the two sins' antics and Diane just looked bored, with Hawk asking, "Do I wanna know?" "Just roll with it," Diane answered boredly with a sigh. The two were now laughing, with Ban still laying down where he got knocked and Meliodas was giggling while bent over, holding his knees. "So great. I thought you might have gotten soft on me," Ban said, while getting up and looking no worse for wear, except for some dirt and a couple of scratches. Meliodas then began to dust off his shoulder before he said, "You've still got it." The two then clasped their right hands together and slammed down onto the floor, looking like they were about to arm wrestle. "Ready?" Ban said slowly. "Oh!" Meliodas exclaimed. The two then began to wrestle, and the amount of strength that the two were using caused cracks to start spreading everywhere, with the two of them at the center of it all, the walls all beginning to break down, just from the two sins having an arm wrestle match. Hawk was now sitting on Diane's knees and was exclaiming, "What's happening?" Diane now had a soft smile as she watched the captain and her object of affection enjoy their reunion. "Those two have been like that as long as I've known them." The Kunoichi all heard Diane and all exclaimed along with Hawk, "They've been like what?" "Just typical boys, so immature," Diane replied. As the rest of the group were watching this, Ban and Meliodas began talking. 720 times. "If I recall correctly, and I do, I've beat you 361 of them," Ban said. "You must have lost your mind. I've won 361 times," Meliodas rebutted. The building and hall just kept falling apart, but Meliodas and Ban were ignoring that and simply began putting in more effort as heard by them shouting. Meliodas and Ban were, somehow, still lying on solid pieces of stones, arm wrestling the whole way down, not caring about the building they were destroying from their match. The rest of the group were all falling down as well, with Sinet being held by Kushina and Elizabeth being held by Naruto. All of the Kunoichi were falling calmly, with Elizabeth and Sinet holding on to Naruto and Kushina like their lives depended on it. Diane simply fell calmly before saying, "Ban looks so handsome right now." "I don't think this is the time," exclaimed Hawk before he began screaming. Back with the knights outside, all of the knights watched in shock as the spell seal was taken down and base dungeon was being completely destroyed. Olgius exclaimed in shock, "The barrier." While the other knights were watching in shock and were shouting in fear. Jericho, however, was shocked and was thinking, "Amazing. Just how much power do the sins even have?" Then Jericho began blushing as she remembered that Ban was also one of the sins. Then she felt herself beginning to get a little hot between her legs before she snapped out of it and shook her head. "Damn it, teacher. Why did I have to also pick up your like of strong men who can overpower me?" She shouted mentally, embarrassed that she picked up her teacher's love of strong men. But that last thought, Jericho heard Golgius shout, "Strategic withdrawal." And all the knights began to run away. Jericho took one last look at the falling ruins of base dungeon before she smiled and began running with the rest of the knights. Rubble of base dungeon. The Kunoichi were completely unharmed except for some dust and were all making sure they were unharmed. They all saw they were fine and also began to check on Sinet and Elizabeth and saw they were fine too. Diane then looked around and saw that it was already dusk before she said, "Oh, it's already dusk. No wonder I was starting to get hungry." Hawk was covered in bumps, bruises, scratches and dirt while exclaiming, "You guys are all ridiculous." Diane was laying down on some rubble and looked up at Meliodas who was standing and with a grin, said, "Anyways, good to see you again, Captain." Meliodas simply looked down at Ban with a smile. A couple minutes later, the group was almost back at Dalmary town when they saw all of the townsfolk looking at the ruins of base dungeon in shock. The townsfolk then saw Sinet, safe and sound, and began rejoicing at the safe return of one of their own. Later, everyone was back at the doctor's building when they checked on Friesia and saw she was still sleeping and decided to let her sleep. The Kunoichi were all smiling at being able to successfully help a civilian and also find another of the 7 deadly sins. They were also especially happy that it was the sin they were looking for since they first arrived in Britannia. Elizabeth then suggested that they all go and make sure Sinet was alright, which they agreed before Ban saw something out of the corner of his eye and began to walk away. Diane noticed this and asked, "Ban, where you going?" A little worried something might be wrong. This gained the attention of everyone else as well, who all turned to see Ban walking into town waving his back at them without turning around. "I'm gonna see if I can find some clothes. Don't worry, Diane. I'll be back a little later," Ban said, getting relieved sighs from everyone. As everyone was smiling at everything turning out okay, only one person wasn't smiling. "Is it true? Are you my Ani-chan?" wondered Naruto. Later at night, everyone is now relaxing on top of the doctor's building with some drinks. Off to the side, Friesia was covered in bandages and was sitting up to eat some fruit as well. Everyone was enjoying themselves when Meliodas gained everyone's attention. "Alright, everyone." Meliodas raised his voice a little, "Allow me to now formally introduce him. This is the fox's sin of greed, Ban." Ban was currently sitting on a barrel with his right leg up on the barrel and his left leg hanging off. He had his right elbow resting on his leg and was cupping his chin and part of his face with his thumb and index finger. He was wearing a blood-red leather jacket with matching pants that were all covered in metal studs. Ban then say, "Hello everyone. Nice to meet you." Meliodas then noticed Ban's change in wardrobe and said, "Whoa, where'd you get that suit?" "Well, I can't very well parade around half naked in front of a princess, now can I?" Ban asked rhetorically. "How'd you buy clothes without any money?" Meliodas asked. "I kinda stumbled across 'em." Ban said, "It was a total fluke. The clothes he wears for most of the anime before changing." Diane just looked to the side, kinda upset, and sighed, which brought Ban's attention to her. "Hey Diane. It's been a while, huh? How have you been?" "I've been fine, not very happy you still have that habit of taking clothes that catch your eye," Diane said, which caused Ban to look slightly sheepish and scratch the back of his head. "Well, it's not like I had money during most of those times," Ban replied, getting Diane to look at him with a deadpan stare. "And the times you did have money?" Diane asked. "Hey, now that's not fair. You know very well that I spent that money on things such as food and supplies or whatever you guys wanted. I only stole clothes because I never had enough for myself afterwards," Ban explained, getting Diane to think about it before she sighed and looked back at him with a smile. "I guess you're right. Sorry about that, it's just," Diane began before Ban cut her off. I know. You don't like watching me steal things because then that makes people mad at me. Don't worry, I remember," Ban said while smiling at Diane, who smiled back. "You began a voice from behind Ban, getting him to turn to a flustered-looking Elizabeth. "It's very nice to meet you, Lord Ban," she exclaimed while bowing. Ban looked uncomfortable. "It's okay, Your Highness. And we're not really big on ceremony, so let's just be friends and please, just call me Ban," he said with small smile. Elizabeth looked surprised before she, too, smiled and said, "Yeah. Does that include me?" asked a voice. Ban was confused and looked at Meliodas before asking, "Captain, aren't we already friends? Why are you asking me again?" "He's not the one asking. Are you sure you don't have a couple of screws loose?" said the voice. Ban then gained a confused look. "Huh? Who said that?" "I did," Hawk said. Ban stared at Hawk for a second before exclaiming, "There's a talking pig here." Everyone began to laugh at Ban's antics when Dr. Dana said, "Dinner's ready." Everyone began to eat and were enjoying themselves when Kashina exclaimed, "Oh. I almost forgot." Everyone began looking at Kashina as she pulled out a paper, a brush and some ink before she moved over to Diane. "Diane. I just remembered, I finally finished the seal." Diane looked at Kashina in shock before she began to smile brightly. "You're serious, you're not messing with me, right?" Kashina shook her head and said, "Nope. I finally finished it in the last couple of hours." "So, where do you want it?" Diane was smiling brightly before she moved her wrist to Kashina and said, "Right here." Kashina smiled and nodded before she began applying the seal. Once she was done, Kashina put the stuff away and said, "Alright, all done. Now, all you have to do is push some mana into the seal and it'll activate." Diane nodded and began to focus. Everyone watched in rapt attention as suddenly, Diane was covered in a giant puff of smoke and when it cleared, there stood Diane in her shrunken jumpsuit at a height of 5 feet and 5 inches. She looked herself over before she began to smile brightly and had tears of joy falling from her eyes. Diane then felt a pair of arms around her and looked up to see Ban was the one holding her. Ban smiled at her and said, "Looks like you finally got your wish from all those years ago." Diane then remembered that she had told Ban that she wanted to be small in order to hug him, and he was right. She began to cry and hug Ban back, who returned the hug. They then released each other before Ban started to walk back to the others but was stopped by Diane, who held onto his sleeve, who had her head down. Diane?" asked Ban. Everyone was wondering what was happening before they were all shocked when Diane suddenly leapt at Ban before she wrapped her arms around her neck and began kissing Ban. Ban was wide-eyed before he relaxed into the kiss and began to return it. Everyone was smiling at this, even Naruto, who saw that Ban and Diane had stopped kissing and had decided to ask something that had been bothering her. "Excuse me, Ban." This got everyone's attention as Naruto moved towards the two sins. Ban turned towards Naruto, who had a serious look. "Yes, what is it?" Naruto began to breathe before she asked something that got everyone's attention. "I wanted to know," Naruto began, "are you my Oni-chan?" Everyone was surprised by this sudden question before they all heard Naruto continue, "You see, my name is Naruto and I am a Jinchuriki and I hold the Kyuubi no Yoko and she is able to tell that my brother is alive because he holds the rest of her chakra. When we arrived, she told me that he had been motionless for the past several years and when I first saw you inside of base dungeon, she told me that you hold her chakra." Everyone was wide-eyed at this and they all turned to Ban, who had his eyes shadowed. Ban then sighed and looked at Naruto with a soft smile before saying, "I could never hide anything from you, right little sis?" Naruto was wide-eyed at this response before she began to tear up and smile, then she launched herself at him and began hugging him like crazy while saying, "I finally found you, Ani-chan." Diane just hugged her back and said, "Yes. Yes, you did." All of the Kunoichi, Meliodas and Diane were all shocked to hear that Ban was actually Naruto. They didn't know what happened to him over the years and they had so many questions, but they knew right now wasn't the time for questions. It was the time to celebrate. What if Naruto has Meliodas' power harem? Thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.